Hey guys, tonight the threshold of propriety. Steam from the locomotive still clung to Clara's heavy wool coat as she stood on the corner of 23rd Street. The soot of New York City felt like a physical weight, a gray veil draped over the frantic, jagged energy of 1912. She clutched the handle of her battered leather trunk until the stitching bit into her palm. Before her stood number 142, a towering, narrow brownstone that seemed to frown down at the cobblestones with its soot-stained windows. This was the place. Mrs. Gable's boarding house for single ladies. It was a monument to respectability. It was a fortress for the weary. It was her only hope in a city that felt far too large for a girl from the Ohio plains. Clara climbed the steep stone steps, her heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs, a stark contrast to the cold, indifferent wind whipping off the Hudson River. She reached for the brass knocker, shaped like a lion's head with a ring through its teeth, and let it fall. The sound was a dull thud, a death knell to her girlhood and the beginning of her life as a working woman. The door did not merely open, it was retracted by a force of nature. Standing there was Mrs. Gable. She was a woman built of sharp angles, starch, and iron-gray hair. Her black silk dress was buttoned so tightly to her chin that it seemed to be the only thing keeping her rigid head attached to her body. Her eyes, the color of wet slate, swept over Clara, from the slight fraying of her hat ribbon to the scuff on her left boot, with the clinical precision of a tax collector. "Name," the woman barked. Her voice sounded like gravel shifting in a rusted tin bucket. Clara Penton, ma'am," she replied. Her voice trembled more than she intended, thin and fragile against the roar of a passing horse-drawn carriage. Mrs. Gable stepped back, signaling Clara to enter with a sharp jerk of her head. The air inside was a thick, stagnant soup, a mixture of boiled cabbage, floor wax, and the faint, antiseptic sting of lye. It was the smell of enforced virtue. "Follow me, Miss Penton, and lift that trunk. Do not drag it across the mahogany. My floors are not for the likes of your luggage to ruin." Clara hoisted the trunk, her muscles aching from the journey, and followed the stiff, unyielding back of the landlady into a small, windowless office off the main hallway. Mrs. Gable sat behind a desk that was polished to a mirror shine. She pulled a heavy, leather-bound ledger toward her and dipped a fountain pen into an inkwell with a deliberate, slow grace. "Before you sign, you will listen," Mrs. Gable began, her gaze fixed on Clara with predatory intensity. "This is not a tenement. It is a house of reputation. You are a working girl, I presume, a stenographer, a shop girl at Macy." "A typist, ma'am, at the New York Life Insurance Company," Clara managed to say, straightening her shoulders to hide her exhaustion. Mrs. Gable gave a sharp, singular nod. "Respectable enough for now. But understand this, your life outside these walls is your business, but your life inside is mine. Rule 1, the curfew is 10 o'clock sharp, not 10:01, not 10:05. At 10, the bolt is thrown. If you are on the street after the bolt is thrown, you remain on the street. I do not care if it is snowing, I do not care if you have been mugged. Am I clear?" "Yes, ma'am," Clara whispered, her throat dry. "Rule 2, Mrs. Gable continued, her pen hovering over the page like a hawk ready to strike. "No men, not brothers, not cousins, not old family friends. If a gentleman calls, he waits in the parlor. You will sit in the chairs by the window in full view of the hallway. There will be no whispering, no closed doors, and absolutely no physical contact. This is a house of God, Miss Penton. I will not have it turned into a den of iniquity by flighty girls with loose morals." Clara felt the walls closing in. Back in Ohio, the farm had been lonely, but it was vast, an endless horizon of corn and sky. Here, in the heart of the greatest city on earth, her world was shrinking to the size of a ledger page. Rule 3, cleanliness. You are entitled to 1 hot bath a week, Saturday nights, scheduled by floor. You will provide your own soap. You will not leave hair in the basin. You will not drip water on the linoleum. If you are found to be untidy, you will be fined 5 cents per offense. Do you have 5 cents to waste, Miss Penton?" "No, ma'am." "I thought not." Mrs. Gable finally looked up, her lips thinning into what might have been a smile, though it lacked any warmth. It was merely a rearrangement of her facial muscles. "I am told you are a quiet girl. I hope that is true. I have evicted girls for less than a loud laugh after hours. Reputation is a fragile thing. Once it chips, it shatters. And I will not have my house shattered by the whims of a girl who thinks the city is a playground." She pushed the ledger across the desk. The paper was yellowed, filled with the names of hundreds of girls who had passed through this door, some to marriage, some to better things, and many to the shadows. Sign here. By signing, you surrender your right to privacy in exchange for my protection. I hold the passkey to every room. I inspect the quarters every Tuesday at noon. If I find anything untoward, liquor, political pamphlets, or correspondence from men of ill repute, your trunk will be on the sidewalk before sunset. No refunds, no excuses. Clara looked at the line. The ink was dark, permanent, and smelled of iron. To sign was to find a home. To refuse was to be swallowed by the cold shadows of the New York piers. She took the pen. Her hand shook as she scrawled her name. Mrs. Gables slammed the ledger shut, the sound echoing like a pistol shot in the small, cramped room. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key, laying it on the desk with a metallic clink. Room 3C, top floor. You share the space with a Miss Miller. She is a seamstress and does not like to be disturbed. Do not bring your troubles to me unless the house is on fire, Miss Penton. Now take your things and go up. Dinner is at 6. If you are late, you do not eat. And for heaven's sake, fix your hat. You look like a common street peddler. Clara picked up the key. It was cold and heavy. It bit into her skin, the iron clasp of her new life. As she turned to leave, she felt Mrs. Gables' eyes burning into her back, a silent, unmoving sentinel of the rules she had just inherited. She began the long, grueling climb up the stairs. Each wooden step groaned under the weight of her trunk. Each floor smelled of different lives, all tucked away in small, dark boxes. She passed the second floor, hearing the muffled sound of a typewriter and a woman coughing. She reached the third floor, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The hallway was dimly lit by a flickering gas lamp that hissed like a snake. Room 3C. She inserted the key. It turned with a reluctant, rusted groan, as if the door itself were protesting her entry. As the door swung open, Clara saw a sliver of a room, a narrow iron bed, a single washstand with a cracked pitcher, and one small window looking out onto a bleak brick wall. She dropped her trunk and sat on the edge of the thin mattress. The springs shrieked in protest. She was in New York. She was independent. She was free. But as she stared at the key in her hand, she realized that every freedom in this city came with a price. And for now, the price was her silence, her obedience, and the ironclad rules of Mrs. Gables' house. Clara looked at her reflection in the small, spotted mirror above the washstand. Her eyes were wide, shadowed with fatigue. She reached up and unpinned her hat, smoothing her hair. "I will survive this," she whispered to the empty room. "I will follow the rules until I am strong enough to break them." Outside, the city roared, a beast of iron and steam. But inside room 3C, the silence was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic ticking of a clock in the hallway, counting down the minutes until the bolt was thrown for the night. The architecture of restriction. The first night in room 3C was not a night of sleep. It was a night of listening to the house breathe. Clara lay on the narrow iron cot, her body stiff as a board, staring at the ceiling, a ceiling so low that it felt as if the weight of the entire city were pressing down upon her chest. The plaster was mapped with 1,000 tiny cracks. They looked like a spider's web, woven by decades of silent, trapped women. In the 1912 boarding house, architecture was not a form of art. It was a form of discipline. The hallways were barely wide enough for 2 women to pass without their skirts brushing. The stairs were steep and treacherous. The doors were thin enough to bleed every secret from one room to the next. Everything about the physical space shouted one word: confinement. As the sun began to crawl over the jagged skyline the next morning, Clara realized that her room was merely a cell within a larger, more intricate hive. She stepped out into the hallway, and the reality of shared life hit her like a physical blow. The air was thick with the scent of singed hair, cheap lavender water, and the sharp, metallic tang of coal dust. "Watch your step, honey," a voice rasped from the shadows. Clara jumped, her hand flying to her throat. Emerging from a doorway across the hall was a woman, Miss Miller, her roommate. She was older, perhaps 30, with fingers that were calloused and pricked by 1,000 needle stabs. She was a seamstress. Her entire life was measured in inches of silk and yards of thread. "The floorboards near the banister are loose," Miss Miller said, pinning a stray lock of hair back with a vicious-looking iron pin. "If you step on 'em at night, the old lady, Mrs. Gable, will hear you from 2 floors down. She knows every creak in this house like it's a note in a hymn." Clara nodded, her eyes wide. "Thank you, I didn't mean to wake you." "Wake me?" Miss Miller let out a dry, mirthless laugh. "In this house, you don't wake up. You just stop pretending to sleep." Between the girls coughing through the walls and the trolley cars clanging on the street, silence is a luxury we can't afford. This house wasn't built for living, it was built for storing. As they descended the stairs together, Clara observed the architecture of restriction in full effect. Every design choice served a purpose. The windows in the hallways were painted shut to prevent communication with people on the street. The lighting was kept to a dim, flickering minimum to discourage late-night reading. Even the banisters were fitted with small wooden knobs to prevent anyone from sliding down them in a moment of youthful joy. "Notice the parlor door," Miss Miller whispered as they reached the first floor. The door to the common room was made of glass, not for beauty, but for surveillance. It allowed Mrs. Gable to see exactly who was sitting with whom without ever having to leave her chair by the fireplace. To be a woman in 1910s, New York was to be constantly watched, but to be a woman in a boarding house was to be under a microscope. The dining room was a long, narrow rectangle, a claustrophobic space where 20 women sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches. There were no chairs with backs. To lean back was to be lazy. You sat upright, you ate your porridge, you spoke in hushed tones. "Look at them," Miss Miller muttered, nodding toward a group of younger girls at the end of the table. "They think they've escaped their mother's parlors. They don't realize they've just traded one cage for a smaller one." Clara watched a girl in a faded blue waist dress. The girl was trying to read a newspaper, but the space was so cramped she had to hold it folded into a tiny square. Every time she moved her elbow, she bumped the woman next to her. It was a constant, low-level friction, a physical reminder that in this house, you did not own your space. Your body was a guest, your soul was a tenant. After breakfast, Clara made her way to the front door, but the hallway seemed to stretch longer than it had the day before. The low ceiling seemed to dip lower. The walls, covered in a dark, floral wallpaper that looked like wilting roses, seemed to lean inward. It was a psychological pressure, a reminder that the city outside was wide and dangerous, and the only safety lay in these narrow, suffocating corridors. She reached the heavy oak front door, the threshold she had crossed with such hope only 24 hours ago. Mrs. Gable stood nearby, dusting a porcelain figurine of a weeping willow. "Going to work, Miss Penton?" the landlady asked, her voice like the grating of a hinge. "Yes, ma'am, to the insurance office." "Keep your eyes on the pavement," Mrs. Gable warned. "A girl who looks up too much is a girl who forgets her place. And remember, 10 o'clock. The Bolt doesn't care if the subway is late." Clara stepped out onto the street, and for a moment, the sheer height of the New York sky made her dizzy. She looked back at the boarding house. From the outside, it looked like any other brownstone, stately, solid, and respectable. But Clara now knew the truth of its architecture. It was a machine designed to grind the spirit down into something small, manageable, and quiet. The ceilings were low because a woman's ambitions were expected to be low. The hallways were narrow because the path of a good girl was narrow. And the rules were many because if a woman were ever given enough room to breathe, she might just realize she didn't need the cage at all. Clara clutched her purse to her side and began the walk to work. Behind her, the door of number 142 clicked shut, a final, decisive sound that echoed in the cold morning air. The communal mirrors. The alarm did not come from a clock. It came from the heavy, rhythmic thud of a copper pipe vibrating against the floorboards, the signal that the furnace had been stoked and the water, however lukewarm, was beginning its sluggish ascent. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. In Mrs. Gable's house, this was the hour of the frantic, the hour of the desperate, the hour of the communal mirror. Clara threw back her thin wool blanket, the morning air in room 3C biting at her skin like a swarm of invisible insects. The room was freezing. A thin glaze of frost had formed on the inside of the windowpane, obscuring the brick wall outside. Beside her, Miss Miller was already upright, her eyes bloodshot from a night spent sewing by candlelight, her fingers moving with mechanical precision as she pinned her hair into a severe, functional bun. "Move fast, girl," Miss Miller croaked, her voice raspy from the morning chill. She didn't look away from her reflection in a handheld shard of glass. "If you aren't at the wash basin in 3 minutes, you'll be washing your face in the dregs of everyone else's grime. The girls on the second floor are already stirring, and once they start, there's no stopping the stampede." Clara grabbed her threadbare towel and her precious tin of rose-scented soap, a luxury that had cost her 3 cents and a skipped lunch. She stepped out into the hallway and joined the ghost-like procession of women in flannel nightgowns. They moved in a silent, grim line toward the single bathroom at the end of the corridor. The bathroom was a sanctuary turned into a battlefield. It was a small, tiled room that smelled of damp plaster, lye, and the metallic tang of old plumbing. There was no privacy here. There was only the efficiency of the working class. "Hurry up, Gertrude. Some of us have to be at the textile mill before the whistle," a voice shouted from the back of the line. The hallway was a chorus of coughs, yawning, and the soft shushing of slippers on worn linoleum. "My pompadour doesn't build itself, Bessie," came the sharp, muffled reply from inside the locked door. "Quality takes time, and if I'm late, it's my wages on the line, not yours." Clara stood in line, her shoulders hunched against the draft. She watched the women, her sisters in toil. In the harsh, flickering light of the hallway gas jet, the respectability they worked so hard to maintain looked fragile. It looked like a mask that was beginning to slip. Underneath the corsets and the high-collared waists were tired bodies. Under the carefully applied rice powder were dark circles of exhaustion that no amount of rouge could truly hide. This was the ritual of the shared vanity, the collective effort to mask the reality of poverty before facing the judgmental eyes of the city. To the world, they had to be ladies. To each other, they were merely survivors. When it was finally Clara's turn, she had exactly 4 minutes before the pounding on the door began again. The basin was stained with a ring of grey soap scum from the woman before her. Clara didn't complain. She simply scrubbed the ceramic with a corner of her towel and splashed the tepid water onto her face. The cold shock cleared the fog of sleep, but it couldn't wash away the anxiety that sat like a stone in her stomach. She looked into the communal mirror, a large, silver-backed glass that was spotted with age and humidity. In this mirror, 10 different lives were reflected every morning. It was a record of their struggle. Clara saw herself. The girl from Ohio was fadding. The working girl was taking her place. Her skin was paler than it had been a month ago. Her eyes were sharper, more guarded. She applied a tiny dab of her rose soap to her neck, closing her eyes for a second to imagine she was somewhere else. Somewhere with a porcelain tub, endless hot water, and a door that she could lock for as long as she pleased. "Time up, new girl," a voice barked, followed by a sharp rap on the wood. Clara stepped aside, yielding her place to a girl who looked no older than 16 but had the hardened gaze of a veteran. Back in the room, the second stage of the ritual began, the struggle of the budget. To look respectable in 1912 was a financial feat of magic. Clara's wage was $6 a week. After Mrs. Gable took 4 for room and board, Clara was left with $2 to cover car fare, lunches, and the upkeep of her professional wardrobe. A single tear in her skirt was a catastrophe. A lost button was a minor tragedy that required a midnight repair. She pulled on her white shirtwaist, a garment she had scrubbed by hand in the basin 2 nights before. It was scorched slightly at the cuff from a hurried iron, but she tucked it deeply into her dark skirt to hide the flaw. Appearance was her only armor. In New York, if you looked poor, you were invisible. If you looked shabby, you were dangerous. "You're doing it wrong," Miss Miller said, appearing behind her like a shadow. She reached out and adjusted Clara's collar, pinning it with a small brass brooch. "Keep your head up, Clara. The floorwalkers at the shops and the managers at the insurance offices, they smell fear like a dog smells meat. If you look like you belong in the gutter, that's where they'll keep you. They'll pay you less and expect more." Clara looked at Miss Miller through the reflection of a small, cracked hand mirror. The older woman's hands were stained with dark dye and pricked with needle marks, but her posture was as straight as a ruler. "How do you do it?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of the house. "How do you pretend every day that we aren't all one missed paycheck away from the street. Miss Miller leaned in close. The scent of stale tea and peppermint was heavy on her breath. We don't pretend, honey. We perform. New York is a stage, and this boarding house is the dressing room. You put on the costume, you say the lines, and you pray the audience doesn't see the holes in your shoes. Now put on your hat and get out there. The curtain is going up, and the city doesn't wait for anyone. Clara fastened her hat, a modest straw thing with a single wilted velvet rose, and took a final look at herself. She didn't see a victim. She saw a soldier preparing for a silent daily war. She checked her coin purse, 10 cents for the day, 5 for the trolley, 5 for a meager lunch. She descended the stairs, the sound of 20 other women's boots creating a rhythmic, mechanical clatter on the wood, a heartbeat for a house that never truly slept. As she passed the parlor, she saw her reflection one last time in the glass of the front door. For a fleeting second, the morning light hit her just right, and she looked exactly like the illustrations in the Ladies' Home Journal, the image of the modern, independent woman. The illusion was complete. She stepped out into the cold, gray morning of 23rd Street, a respectable girl with a penny in her pocket and a secret in her heart. The ritual was over. The survival had begun. A penny for your reputation. In the cramped confines of the 23rd Street boarding house, there were two types of currency. There was the cold, hard nickel that paid for your trolley fare, and then there was the far more volatile currency of character. In 1912, a woman's reputation was not a private matter. It was a public commodity, traded and devalued over lukewarm tea and stale bread. Mrs. Higgins, the primary gossip of the second floor, was the unofficial banker of this invisible ledger. She was a widow of indeterminate age with a nose that seemed designed to sniff out impropriety through closed doors. To Mrs. Higgins, every late arrival was a scandal, every new hat was a sign of a benefactor, and every silent boarder was a conspirator. Clara learned the weight of this currency on a rainy Tuesday evening. She had stayed 10 minutes late at the insurance office to finish a ledger, an act of diligence she hoped would earn her a promotion. But as she stepped into the foyer, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her, she realized she had committed a different kind of transgression. The parlor door was slightly ajar. Through the glass, she saw them, Mrs. Higgins, Mrs. Gable, and a younger girl named Martha, huddled together like a coven of black-clothed judges. 10:15, she heard Mrs. Higgins whisper. The woman didn't need a clock. She had a biological internal rhythm for the house rules. The Penton girl, that's the third time this week she's walked in with flushed cheeks and a damp hem. It isn't the work that keeps a girl out in this weather, it's the company. Clara froze in the hallway. The air felt suddenly thin. The floral wallpaper seemed to tighten around her. She was a girl of impeccable upbringing, a daughter of the church. Yet here, her character was being dismantled with a few sharp exhales of breath. She says she's a typist, Martha chimed in, her voice dripping with the peculiar cruelty of the insecure. But I saw her looking at a jewelry display on Broadway. How does a $6-a-week girl afford to even look at diamonds? Unless, of course, she expects someone to buy them for her. This was the danger of the boarding house. In a space where no one had anything of their own, everyone felt entitled to the details of your life. Privacy was not a right, it was a suspicion. Clara realized then that Mrs. Higgins kept a mental ledger more accurate than any bank. On the left side were the credits, attending church, wearing modest colors, keeping one's eyes on the floor. On the right were the debits, a stray hair, a letter with a male handwriting, a smile shared with a postman, or worst of all, an unexplained 10 minutes. If your ledger went into the red, the consequences were swift. You weren't just mocked, you were isolated. The other girls would stop sharing the wash basin, the landlady would lose your mail, and eventually you would find your trunk on the sidewalk, not for a crime you committed, but for a rumor you couldn't outrun. Clara took a deep breath, straightened her spine, and pushed the parlor door open. The silence that followed was deafening. It was a physical wall of judgment. "Good evening, Mrs. Gable." "Good evening, ladies," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly but holding its ground. Mrs. Higgins didn't look up from her knitting. The silver needles clicked together like teeth. "Late again, Miss Penton. The city is a dangerous place for a girl with a..." wandering disposition. "The office was busy, ma'am," Clara replied. "Honest work doesn't always keep to a schedule." "Honesty," Mrs. Higgins drawled, finally looking up with eyes like cold marbles, "is something that is seen, not just said. A girl who values her place in a respectable house ensures she is seen in the right places at the right times. To do otherwise is to invite conversation." Clara felt a hot flash of anger, a spark of the rebellion she didn't know she possessed. "If conversation is all that occupies this parlor, perhaps I am better off in my room. At least the walls don't pretend to be my friends." She turned and fled up the stairs, her heart thundering. She could hear their whispers starting up again before she even reached the first landing. She had just spent a penny of her reputation on that retort, and she knew she would pay for it in the morning. When she reached room 3C, Miss Miller was sitting on her bed, mending a corset. She didn't look up. "You shouldn't have talked back," the seamstress said quietly. "Higgins is a vulture. She doesn't eat meat, she eats names. Now she'll have you for breakfast, lunch, and dinner." "It's not fair," Clara cried, throwing her damp hat onto the chair. "I've done nothing wrong." "Fair has nothing to do with it, Clara," Miss Miller said, finally looking up. Her face was tired, etched with the knowledge of a dozen such houses. "In this city, a man's reputation is built on what he earns. A woman's is built on what she hides. If you want to survive Mrs. Higgins, you have to become a ghost. Give them nothing. No smiles, no frowns, no stories. Because in this house, a story is just a rope they use to hang you." Clara sat on the edge of her bed, the springs groaning in sympathy. She looked at her small coin purse. She had exactly 4 cents. But as she listened to the muffled laughter coming from the parlor downstairs, she realized she was far poorer than she thought. Her character was being traded away, a penny at a time, in a ledger she wasn't allowed to see. She stayed awake for a long time that night, listening to the house. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a witness, every rustle of the curtains felt like a secret. She realized that she was no longer just fighting the city for a wage. She was fighting her own shadow for the right to be called respectable. In the world of Mrs. Higgins, innocence was not the absence of guilt, it was the absence of being noticed. And Clara Penton had just become the most noticed girl on 23rd Street. Gaslight ambitions. The transition from the suffocating, lace-trimmed air of Mrs. Gable's parlor to the frantic, ink-stained atmosphere of the New York Life Insurance Company was like stepping from a tomb into a factory. If the boarding house was designed to crush the spirit through silence, the office was designed to exhaust the body through noise. It was 1912. The era of the new woman had arrived with a roar, but she did not arrive on wings of gold. She arrived on a crowded, swaying trolley car, her stomach empty, her head aching, and her fingers permanently stained with the black, oily smudge of carbon paper. Clara sat in the stenography pool, a vast, windowless cavern in the basement of a granite skyscraper. It was a room filled with 60 identical oak desks, 60 identical black Remington typewriters, and 60 identical women. The sound was deafening. It was not a noise, it was a physical force, a mechanical hailstone, a relentless, rhythmic clack-clack-clack that drowned out thought, suppressed conversation, and even swallowed the sound of one's own ragged breath. "Eyes on the shorthand, Miss Penton. The keys do not require your admiration, the paper does." The voice belonged to Mr. Henderson, the floor manager. He was a man who moved like a pendulum, swinging back and forth between the rows of desks with a silver pocket watch held firmly in his palm. He was the keeper of time, the arbiter of efficiency. In this room, a woman was not an individual with a name. She was a biological extension of the machine she operated, a set of 10 fingers and 2 eyes at the service of maritime insurance. Clara's fingers ached with a dull, throbbing heat. The tips were raw, the delicate skin worn thin by the constant, violent strike against the hard, circular glass keys. This was the new ambition she had dreamed of back in Ohio. She had traded the sun-drenched fields for the flickering, greenish hue of the gas lamps, a light that made every girl's skin look like pale parchment. There was no glamour in this independence. There was only the smell of ozone, machine oil, and the bitter dust of erasing crumbs. By noon, the ink had migrated from the ribbons to Clara's hands, then to her forehead as she brushed away a stray lock of hair. And finally, it seemed to seep into her very soul. She looked at her inky fingers, the badge of her modern life. To Mrs. Gable, these stains were a sign of lowly toil. To Mrs. Higgins, they were a mark of the servant class. But to Clara, they were proof that she was earning her own bread. Every smudge was a cent. Every stain was a step away from the farm. "Don't look at the clock, dear," whispered Sarah, the girl at the neighboring desk. Sarah was barely 20, but her eyes had a permanent, nervous twitch from the strain of reading blurred shorthand. "The clock is a liar. If you look at it, the minute hand freezes just to spite you. Look at the paper, only the paper." "I just need to breathe," Clara whispered back, her fingers never stopping their rhythmic dance. Clack, clack, ding. She threw the carriage return with a sharp, metallic snap that echoed the frustration in her chest. "Breathe on your lunch pail or breathe on the street," Mr. Henderson barked, passing behind them like a shadow. "Insurance doesn't sleep, Miss Penton. The Titanic didn't wait for a slow typist, and neither will this company. Productivity is the only currency I accept." This was the grueling reality of the 1912 workforce. The hours were not just long, they were heavy. From 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, they were forbidden to speak, forbidden to stand without permission, and most cruelly, forbidden to err. A single typo meant retyping a 4-page legal document by hand. There was no delete key in this industrial age. There was only the excruciating, soul-crushing labor of perfection. When the 6 o'clock whistle finally screamed, a piercing, industrial howl that ripped through the basement, the room did not erupt in joy. Instead, there was a collective, weary sigh, a sound like air escaping a punctured lung. 60 women stood up as one, their joints cracking like dry twigs, their backs arched like bows from hours of hunching. Clara looked at her desk. She had produced 42 pages of legal correspondence. Her fingers were cramped into rigid claws. As she walked toward the exit, she passed the grand department store windows on Broadway. Behind the glass, mannequins wore exquisite silk gowns and lace-trimmed hats, the very things Clara and her sisters labored to afford, yet could never wear. Their inky fingers would ruin the fabric. Their tired eyes would betray the lie of the fashion. The new woman was supposed to be free, but as Clara boarded the uptown trolley, her head resting against the cold, vibrating window, she felt like a different kind of prisoner. She was a slave to the ticking clock, a slave to the heavy Remington, and a slave to the respectability that demanded she work in an office for $6 a week rather than a factory for 8. She arrived back at the boarding house at 6:45 p.m., exhausted, drained, and just 15 minutes before the dinner bell. Her hands were still stained. She rushed to the shared wash basin, scrubbing frantically with her rose-scented soap, but the black ink of the ribbon was stubborn. It settled into the fine creases of her skin like a permanent record of her labor. "Still carrying the marks of the trade, I see," Mrs. Higgins remarked, appearing in the doorway like a vulture sensing a carcass. She looked at Clara's hands with a curl of her lip. "A lady's hands should be soft, Miss Penton. Those look like the hands of a chimney sweep." "I am not a lady, Mrs. Higgins," Clara said, her voice cold, brittle, and tired. "I am a typist, and this ink, this filth, is what pays the rent you so dearly love to collect." She pushed past the woman, her heart heavy with a mixture of pride and despair. In the office, she was a machine. In the boarding house, she was a suspect. The gaslight ambitions she had carried all the way from the Midwest were flickering in the harsh New York wind. She realized that the city didn't want her to succeed. It wanted her to function. And then, when her eyes failed and her fingers grew stiff, it wanted her to disappear. Clara went to her room and sat in the dark. She looked at a small scrap of paper she had smuggled out, a poem she had tried to compose during her 10-minute lunch break. The ink was smudged. The words were simple, but they were hers. She tucked the paper under her mattress, right next to her secret dreams and her dwindling coins. Tomorrow, the whistle would blow again. Tomorrow, the clack, clack, clack would return. But for tonight, she would hold on to the one thing the gaslight couldn't take, the knowledge that she was still a human soul, hidden beneath the ink and the starch. The parlor requirement. In the 1910s, the parlor of a boarding house was not a place of relaxation. It was a theater of surveillance. It was the only neutral ground where the world of men and the world of women were permitted to collide. Yet, the collision was buffered by layers of lace, etiquette, and the unblinking eyes of Mrs. Gable. To invite a gentleman into the house was to invite him into a cage where every word was weighed and every glance was measured. The rule was absolute. No male guest was to pass the threshold of the hallway. No male foot was to touch the staircase. If a man wished to see a lady, he was ushered into the front parlor, a room that smelled perpetually of mothballs, lavender, and the cold ash of a dying fire. Clara sat on the edge of a velvet settee that was so stiff it felt like sitting on a pile of bricks. Across from her sat Thomas, a young clerk from the insurance office who had, with great trembling, asked if he might call upon her. He was a kind man with nervous hands and a clean-shaven face, but in the oppressive atmosphere of the parlor, he looked like a prisoner facing a tribunal. Between them sat the low tea table, and 5 feet away, sitting in her high-backed mahogany chair, was Mrs. Gable. She was not reading, she was not knitting, she was simply existing. She sat as motionless as a gargoyle, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on a point exactly 3 inches above Thomas's head. She was the chaperone, the silent judge, the human barrier to intimacy. "Though the weather has been remarkably damp for April, hasn't it, Miss Penton?" Thomas asked. His voice cracked slightly, the sound echoing in the silent room. "It has indeed, Mr. Howard," Clara replied, her voice sounding thin and artificial to her own ears. "I believe the mud on 23rd Street is quite a challenge for one's boots." "Indeed, quite a challenge," Thomas trailed off. He reached for his teacup, the china rattling against the saucer with a sharp, rhythmic clink-clink-clink. "Mrs. Gable cleared her throat, a dry, rasping sound that felt like a warning. Clara felt her face flush. She wanted to tell Thomas about the poem she had written. She wanted to ask him if he also felt like a gear in a giant, uncaring machine. But under the parlor requirement, such thoughts were forbidden. You did not speak of the soul in the parlor. You spoke of the weather, the church, and the price of coal. The architecture of the room was designed to discourage secrets. The chairs were placed far apart, the lamps were turned up high to eliminate shadows, and the heavy velvet curtains were pulled back just enough so that any passerby on the street could see the respectability within. "I brought you this," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, paper-wrapped parcel. Before he could hand it to Clara, Mrs. Gable spoke. Her voice was a cold, sharp blade. "All gifts must be unwrapped in the presence of the house mother, Mr. Howard. Propriety demands transparency." Thomas hesitated, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. He slowly unwrapped the paper. Inside was a single, pressed wildflower from the park, a small blue larkspur. It was a humble gift, a silent protest against the gray concrete of the city. Mrs. Gable leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she inspected the flower as if it were a contraband weapon. After a long, agonizing silence, she gave a microscopic nod. "Common flora. Acceptable, however, keep the stems off the lace doilies." Clara took the flower, her fingers briefly brushing Thomas's hand. The contact was electric, a sudden, sharp reminder that they were human beings made of flesh and blood, not just borders and callers. But she pulled her hand away instantly, terrified of the ledger Mrs. Gable kept in her mind. "Thank you, Mr. Howard," Clara whispered. It's beautiful. I thought you might like a bit of the outside." "Inside," Thomas said, his eyes searching hers for a moment of genuine connection. But the moment was broken by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Each second was a reminder that the calling hour was nearing its end. In 30 minutes, Mrs. Gable would stand up, and Thomas would be ushered out into the cold night, and Clara would be sent back to the narrow hallways and the low ceilings. This was the stilted courtship of the 1910s boarding house. It was a romance conducted in a vacuum, a love story written in shorthand. There could be no whispers, no private jokes, no shared dreams. To fall in love under the eyes of Mrs. Gable was like trying to grow a rose in a cellar. It was possible, but the result was often pale and fragile. "I must be going," Thomas said, standing up as the clock struck 8. The parlor requirement dictated that 30 minutes was sufficient for a first call. To stay longer would be to suggest an unseemly familiarity. "I will see you at the office, Mr. Howard," Clara said, standing as well. Mrs. Gable rose with the grace of a folding ruler. I shall see the gentleman to the door. Miss Penton, go to your room. It is nearly time for the night bolt." Clara watched Thomas walk away. He looked smaller as he moved toward the heavy oak door. As he stepped out into the dark, rainy street, she felt a wave of loneliness that was more physical than a bruise. She looked at the blue larkspur in her hand. It was already beginning to wilt in the stagnant, heated air of the parlor. She climbed the stairs to the third floor, her footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. She passed the other rooms, each one holding a woman who had likely sat in that same parlor, had her gifts inspected by the same landlady, and felt the same hollow ache of a restricted heart. The parlor requirement was not just a rule about guests, it was a rule about the heart. It taught you that your feelings were something to be managed, something to be policed, something that belonged to the house mother more than they belonged to you. As Clara entered room 3C, she placed the flower in a glass of water on the washstand. It looked out of place against the cracked porcelain and the lye soap. She sat on her bed and listened to the heavy thud of the front door bolt being thrown downstairs. The cage was locked. The world of men was gone. And as the gaslight flickered and died, Clara realized that the hardest rule of all wasn't the curfew or the chores. It was the rule that said she must never, ever be alone with her own heart. Silk threads and threadbare dreams. In the year 1912, a woman's dignity was held together by nothing more than a few strands of mercerized cotton and the strength of her own relentless denial. For the boarders of Mrs. Gable's house, the day did not end when they escaped the suffocating air of the insurance office or the frantic floor of the department store. It merely shifted into a second, more delicate, and far more exhausting form of labor. It was the labor of the needle, the nightly, secret ritual of mending appearances. Clara sat on the very edge of her narrow iron cot in room 3C. The gaslight had been turned down to a mere blue flicker to save on the meter, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper. In her lap lay her only silk waist, a cream-colored garment with lace inserts that was the cornerstone of her entire respectability. But the silk was shattered, a term seamstresses used for the way old, tired fabric splits into tiny, irreparable shards under the weight of its own existence. Image, a young woman leaning dangerously close to a flickering lamp, her face etched with fatigue as she meticulously sews a delicate white blouse. "If you pull that thread too tight, you'll ruin the whole shoulder, Clara," Miss Miller murmured from the dark corner of the room. The older woman was hunched over her own project, a heavy wool skirt that had seen so many winters the hem was now a graveyard of 5 different shades of black thread. "I have to fix it, Martha," Clara whispered. Her eyes were stinging, straining in the dim, yellow light. "If the girls at the insurance office see the fraying at the collar, if Mr. Henderson sees the thinning at the elbows, they'll think I'm losing my grip. In this city, the moment they think you are shabby, you become invisible, or worse, you become a target." In the cruel vocabulary of the 1910s boarding house, shabby was more than a description, it was a death sentence. It was the first step toward the tenements, the first undeniable sign that the city was winning. To be poor was a struggle many shared, but to look poor was a moral failing. Thus, the night was spent in a desperate, silent war against gravity, friction, and wear. Clara moved her needle with trembling, practiced fingers, in and out, a rhythmic, hypnotic motion that echoed the hollow ticking of the grandfather clock in the downstairs hall. She was not just sewing fabric, she was mending her very dreams. Every stitch was a carefully constructed lie told to the public, a claim that she was still a woman of the middle class, a claim that her $6 a week wage was sufficient, a claim that she was not slowly drowning in the gray tide of New York. "We are all just weavers of illusions, aren't we?" Miss Miller said, her voice dry and brittle as old parchment. She bit off a thread with a sharp, savage snap of her teeth. "Look at this skirt. It's more patches than original wool now. I've mended it so many times it could practically stand up on its own without me inside it. But tomorrow, when I walk to the shop, the men on the street will see a lady of means, and that lie is the only bit of power I have left." The room was filled with the soft, metallic snip of scissors and the dry rustle of fabric. Across the narrow hallway, Clara knew other women, the typists, the shop girls, the telephone operators, were doing the exact same thing. They were whitening their wilted collars with chalk to hide the yellowing of age. They were blackening the scuffs on their only boots with soot from the chimney. They were turning their cuffs inside out to hide the frayed edges from the sharp eyes of the world. This was the art of mending appearances. It was a secret sisterhood of the threadbare. If a man in 1912 had a hole in his coat, it was often seen as a sign of a busy, productive life. But if a woman had a single hole in her glove, it was seen as a hole in her character. Clara reached the most difficult part of her repair, the underarm, where the silk had thinned to a ghostly, translucent transparency. She took a tiny scrap of ribbon she had saved from a chocolate box, a gift from a lifetime ago, and placed it underneath as a stay. It was a slightly different shade of white, but under the harsh, flickering gaslight of the insurance office, she prayed no one would notice the deception. Stitch, pause, breathe. Her back ached with a dull, throbbing heat. Her eyes burned from the constant flicker of the lamp. The silk threads of her ambition were becoming as worn and brittle as the garment in her hands. She thought of the wealthy women she saw on Fifth Avenue, women who discarded silk dresses simply because they were out of season, not because they were falling apart at the seams. To those women, clothing was a secondary skin. To Clara, it was a suit of armor that had to be polished and patched every single night. There, Clara whispered, holding the waist up to the blue light. The repair was visible if you looked closely, a tiny, raised scar on the silk where the needle had fought the fabric. But from a distance, in the rush of the morning trolley, it would pass for perfection. "It'll do," Miss Miller said, glancing over with a sympathetic nod. "For another month at least, but a word of advice, Clara, don't raise your arm too high when you're filing those papers tomorrow. Armor only works as long as you don't show the chinks to the enemy." Clara folded the garment with the reverence of a priestess handling a holy relic. She placed it at the very bottom of her trunk and sat back, her hands finally still. The threadbare dreams were tucked away for the night. She looked at her fingers, raw, pricked by the needle in a dozen places, and still carrying the faint, stubborn stain of the day's ink. She realized then that the most exhausted part of her wasn't her body. It was the part of her that had to pretend. The constant, waking vigilance, the need to ensure that not a single thread was out of place, that not a single scuff was visible, was a weight heavier than the trunk she had carried up those 3 flights of stairs on her very first day. As she blew out the lamp, the acrid smell of burnt wick filled the cramped room. In the absolute darkness, she couldn't see the patches on the walls or the frays on her sleeves. In the darkness, everyone in the boarding house was equal. But she knew that in 6 short hours, the copper pipes would thud, the sun would rise over the tenements, and the performance of the respectable lady would begin all over again. She lay down on the hard, lumpy mattress, her mind already calculating the impossible cost of a new pair of gloves. 1 meal skipped, 2, maybe 3. She closed her eyes and saw a world made of silk, unbreakable, shimmering, and whole. But as she drifted into a fitful sleep, her hand instinctively clutched the edge of her blanket, feeling for the holes, ready to mend whatever broke next. 10 minutes past 10. The city of New York in 1912 was a labyrinth of iron and shadow, but for Clara Penton, it had suddenly become a ticking time bomb. It was 9:52 p.m. She was 6 long blocks away from 23rd Street, and the sky had decided to open up in a cold, torrential downpour that turned the cobblestones into a slick, black mirror. She ran with her heavy skirts gathered in one trembling hand and her hat pinned precariously to her head, her breath coming in ragged, searing gasps that burned her throat. The curfew bell did not actually ring in the city air, but it rang in her mind, a relentless metallic tolling. 10 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 10 o'clock. In Mrs. Gable's house, 10 o'clock was not just a time, it was the moment of transformation. At 9:59 you were a resident, at 10:01 you were an outcast. The heavy iron bolt on the front door was not merely a lock, it was a guillotine for a woman's reputation. "Please," Clara whispered, her boots splashing through a deep, muddy puddle that soaked her stockings to the knee. "Please, just let the trolley be fast, just this once." The panic was not just about finding a place to sleep. If Clara were locked out, she would have to spend the night in a hotel, a place no respectable girl would ever go alone or worse on the street. By morning, the news would have traveled from the night watchman to the landlady, from the landlady to the boarders. and by noon to the insurance office. A girl who couldn't keep her hours was a girl who couldn't be trusted with ledgers or with her own virtue. Eviction was a shadow that followed every border, but the lockout was the swiftest way to trigger it. 9:55 p.m. She reached the corner of Broadway. The street lamps flickered violently in the wind, casting distorted shadows that seemed to reach for her ankles. She saw the silhouette of the boarding house in the distance, a dark, unyielding monolith against the gray sky. The windows were mostly dark, save for the dim, sickly gaslight in the foyer where Mrs. Gable sat, her ledger open, her gold pocket watch clicking in her palm. Clara's lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. Every step was a battle against the wet wool of her skirts, which had grown heavy and sodden, dragging at her knees like anchors. She thought of the girls she had heard about in whispers, the ones who arrived at 10:05 and were forced to plead through the keyhole, only to have their trunks set out on the sidewalk the following morning. 9:58 p.m. She was half a block away. She could see the front door now. The heavy oak portal looked like a mouth ready to close forever. Inside, she knew Mrs. Gable was rising from her chair with the mechanical precision of an executioner. The woman would walk to the door with a measured, slow pace. She would take the heavy iron bolt in her hand, and precisely as the clock in the hallway struck the first note of 10, she would slide it home. Clack-thud, the sound of a life ending. Wait, Clara tried to scream, but it came out as a pathetic, strangled sob. She reached the bottom of the stone steps. Her foot slipped on the wet granite. She went down on one knee, the sharp pain shooting up her leg, but she didn't stop. She scrambled up, her gloves covered in city muck, her hat hanging by a single, strained pin. 9:59 p.m. She threw herself at the door just as the first chime echoed through the glass. Bong. She grabbed the brass lion's head knocker and hammered it against the wood, not with the polite tap of a lady, but with the frantic, raw desperation of a drowning sailor. Bong, the second chime. Through the frosted glass, she saw a shadow move. It was the tall, thin, terrifying silhouette of Mrs. Gable. The woman's hand was already on the bolt. Clara could see the glint of the brass through the window. Mrs. Gable, it's Clara, please, the trolley. The rain, it wasn't my fault. The shadow didn't move, it didn't hesitate. The third, fourth, and fifth chimes rang out in the hollow hallway. Clara pressed her face against the cold glass, her hot tears mixing with the icy rain. This was the moment of the panic. In those few seconds, she saw her entire future vanishing, the office job gone, her mother's disappointment back in Ohio, the cold, hard benches of a police station. Bong, the 10th chime. The bolt began to slide. Clara heard the metal grinding against the bracket, a slow, agonizing sound that felt like it was tearing through her heart. Please, she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. The bolt stopped. A long, terrifying silence followed. The rain hammered against the roof, the wind howled through the iron railings. Then, slowly, very slowly, the bolt slid back. The door opened just 6 inches. Mrs. Gable stood there. She was not a woman of mercy, she was a woman of mathematics. She held her pocket watch up to the dim light of the foyer. 10 minutes past 10 by the street clock, Miss Penton, the landlady said. Her voice was as cold and sharp as a winter frost. But the house clock says you have exactly 3 seconds of grace. Clara collapsed into the hallway, her wet skirts pooling on the polished mahogany floor she had been told never to ruin. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't speak. Look at you, Mrs. Gable sneered, looking down at the shivering, mud-stained girl with pure disdain. A disgrace. If the neighbors saw you arriving in such a state, at such an hour, the reputation of this house would be in the gutter with you. You look like one of those streetwalkers from the Bowery. I'm so sorry, ma'am, Clara managed to gasp between shudders. Do not speak, go to your room. You will be fined 50 cents for the professional cleaning of this floor, and you will not have tea privileges for a month. If you are ever this close to the bolt again, Miss Penton, I will not stop my hand. Do you understand? I value my sleep more than I value your presence in this house. Yes, ma'am. Clara crawled to her feet and began the long, agonizing climb to the 3rd floor. Each step was a victory, Each step was a humiliation. Her knees were bruised, her dress was ruined, and her dignity was in tatters. When she finally reached room 3C, Miss Miller was standing by the window, her face pale in the moonlight. She didn't say a word. She simply walked over, took Clara's wet coat, and wrapped a warm shawl around her shoulders. In the silence of the room, Clara realized that the panic would never really leave her. Every night for the rest of her life, she would hear that bolt sliding home, and she would wonder if next time she would be on the other side of the door. Stale bread and high society. Dinner at Mrs. Gable's house was not a meal. It was a diplomatic assembly where the stakes were survival and status. At exactly 6:15, the brass bell clanged through the hallways. Its sound was a summons to the long, narrow dining room in the basement. Here, under the dim, flickering glow of 2 gas jets, the social hierarchy of the boarding house was carved as deeply as the nicks in the mahogany table. The seating arrangement was an unwritten law. At the head of the table sat the elites, the girls who worked at high-end department stores like Lord & Taylor. They had softer hands, they wore the latest, if slightly frayed, fashions, and they looked down upon the industrialists, the girls from the factories and the laundry pools. Clara, as a typist, sat somewhere in the precarious middle, a member of the white-collar poor, struggling to keep her elbows off the stained tablecloth. The food was a testament to Mrs. Gable's legendary frugality. Tonight, it was a thin, watery mutton stew and bread that had passed its prime 3 days ago. The mutton was mostly gristle, the potatoes were translucent, and the bread required a sturdy set of teeth and a great deal of imagination to swallow. "I heard that Macy's is looking for new floor girls," whispered Evelyn, a girl with a sharp chin and a sharper tongue who sat at the favored end of the table. She picked at her gristle with a silver-plated fork as if she were at a banquet at the Waldorf Astoria. "But of course, they only hire girls with a certain genie size quoi. One must have a pedigree, you know." "Pedigree doesn't pay for the trolley, Evelyn," Miss Miller muttered from the far end of the table, her voice thick with the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift at the sewing machine. Evelyn stiffened, her eyes flicking toward Mrs. Gable, who sat at the head of the table, presiding over the stew like a silent, black-clad vulture. "Propriety, Miss Miller, propriety is what keeps this house from becoming a tenement. If we stop acting like ladies, we might as well be living in the Bowery." This was the politics of the table. Even over a bowl of grey soup, these women fought for a sense of superiority. If you could prove you were more refined than the girl sitting next to you, you felt a little less like a servant of the city. High society was a dream they all chased, but here it was performed with stale bread and chipped china. "Pass the salt, Miss Penton," Mrs. Higgins barked from across the table. Clara reached for the shaker. Her fingers were still faintly stained with ink, a detail that did not escape the collective gaze of the table. "Inky fingers at the dinner table," Mrs. Higgins tusked, her voice carrying a manufactured pity. "It's a pity the insurance office doesn't provide enough soap for its employees, or perhaps the work is just too dirty for a delicate girl." Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She gripped her spoon until her knuckles turned white. "The work is honest, Mrs. Higgins, and I'd rather have ink on my hands than malice in my heart." The table went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of spoons hitting the bottom of nearly empty bowls. To speak back was to risk a debit in the social ledger, but Clara was tired of being the target of their shared insecurities. "That will be enough, Miss Penton," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dropping like a stone into a well. "There will be no philosophy at my table. Eat your bread or leave it. The cost is the same." As the meal progressed, the conversation turned to high hopes. This was the second part of the ritual. Each girl, no matter how tired, had a story she told herself to get through the night. "My beau is going to be promoted to junior manager next month," chirped Martha, the youngest boarder. "He says he'll take me to the theater, the real theater, not the Nickelodeon. He's going to buy me a hat with a real ostrich plume. And my uncle in Chicago is sending for me," added another girl, her eyes wide with a desperate kind of hope. "He opened a stationery shop. I'll have my own room, a room with a window that looks at a park, not a brick wall." They traded these dreams like precious gems. Yet beneath the table, Clara could see their scuffed shoes and their mended hems. These high hopes were the only thing that made the stale bread palatable. Without the dream of the ostrich plume or the Chicago park, the grey mutton would be impossible to swallow. Clara looked at her own plate. She didn't have a beau with a promotion. She didn't have an uncle in Chicago. Her high hope was simpler. She wanted to finish the week without a typo. She wanted to save enough for a new pair of stockings, and secretly, she wanted to write a poem that didn't end in a sigh. "You're very quiet tonight, Clara," Miss Miller whispered as they prepared to rise from the table. "Thinking of your own high society." "No," Clara said, looking at the empty bowls and the weary, painted faces of her housemates. "I was just thinking that we're all so busy looking up at the people above us that we don't see the people sitting right next to us." The dinner was over. Mrs. Gable stood, signaling the end of the assembly. The girls filed out of the basement, their spirits momentarily buoyed by their shared illusions, only to be crushed again by the narrow hallways and the low ceilings of the floors above. Clara stayed behind for a moment, watching the housemaid clear the table. She saw a piece of stale bread that Evelyn had left behind, a piece she had deemed unfit for a lady of her standing. Clara picked it up and tucked it into her pocket. High society might be built on ostrich plumes and department store pedigrees, but survival was built on the crumbs that the ladies left behind. She walked up the stairs, the taste of grey mutton still in her mouth, but her heart was lighter. She had survived another meal, she had held her ground, and in the politics of the boarding house, that was the greatest victory of all. Forbidden correspondence. In the strict moral geography of Mrs. Gable's boarding house, the front desk was not merely a piece of furniture, it was a border crossing. Every afternoon, the postman's sharp whistle signaled the arrival of the world outside, a world that Mrs. Gable viewed with profound, unyielding suspicion. To her, a letter was not a message. It was a potential scandal wrapped in a cheap envelope. It was a forbidden correspondence waiting to ignite. The routine was as predictable as it was intrusive. The mail was never delivered directly to the girls. Instead, it was laid out on the heavy mahogany sideboard in the foyer. But before a single boarder could lay a finger on her mail, Mrs. Gable performed her ritualistic inspection. She did not open the envelopes, that would be a federal crime, but she did everything short of it. She held them up against the gaslight to see the ghostly silhouette of the pages. She sniffed them for the unauthorized scent of tobacco or cheap cologne, and she memorized every return address with the predatory precision of a hawk. "A letter from a Mr. Julian Vance, Miss Penton," Mrs. Gable asked one evening. Her voice was a low, vibrating hum of calculated disapproval. She held a cream-colored envelope between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a contaminated relic. A bold, masculine hand. "Not a relative, I presume, since the surname does not match yours in the slightest." Clara felt a cold shiver of dread crawl down her spine. Julian was a clerk she had met at a library lecture, a man who spoke of poetry, the changing city, and the silent rebellion of the working class. "He is an acquaintance, ma'am. We discuss literature and history." "Literature," Mrs. Gable repeated, the word tasting like vinegar in her mouth. "Literature is often the silk cloak worn by libertines, Miss Penton. I will allow this one to pass, but if Mr. Vance's name appears on my sideboard again, it will be returned to the postmaster as unclaimed. This is a house of labor, not a depot for romantic debris." Clara took the letter, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't open it in the hallway. She didn't even open it in the room until she was certain Miss Miller was fast asleep. This was the reality of 1912. Your thoughts were your own, but your paper trail belonged to the house mother. However, Clara was not the only one with secrets. As the weeks turned into months, she discovered the underground post of the boarding house. The women had developed a complex, invisible system of smuggling that bypassed the front desk entirely. "Don't trust the sideboard, honey," whispered Rose, a fiery-haired girl from the fourth floor who was secretly involved with the suffragette movement. "If you're expecting something dangerous, tell them to leave it at the bakery on the corner. The baker's wife, Mrs. O'Malley, is a friend of the cause. She hides our correspondence in the flour sacks." Clara stared at her, stunned. "The suffragettes? Rose, if Mrs. Gable finds those pamphlets, you'll be on the sidewalk in an hour. Your name will be blacklisted across every respectable house in the city." "She won't find them," Rose said, her eyes flashing with a sharp, dangerous light. "We sew them into the linings of our winter coats. We hide them under the loose floorboards in the washroom. We pass them like ghosts in the night. A letter is a small thing, Clara, but a letter can start a fire that no landlady can extinguish." The forbidden correspondence wasn't just about lovers. It was about the forbidden ideas of the new woman, radical thoughts about voting, about equal wages, and about a life that didn't involve Mrs. Gable's iron bolt. The boarding house was a cage, but these letters were the cracks in the bars. One rainy Thursday, Clara decided to take the ultimate risk. She had a letter for Julian, a letter where she had finally dared to write down her observations on the strike at the textile mills. It was political, it was personal, it was a threat to her respectability. She couldn't simply walk out with it in her hand. Mrs. Gable was sitting in her usual spot, her eyes fixed on everyone's hands as they exited. Clara tucked the letter into the top of her stocking, the sharp, crisp edge of the paper biting into her skin with every step. Step, breathe, step, smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," Clara said as she reached the heavy oak door. The landlady's eyes swept over her with the speed of a razor. "Your gait is stiff today, Miss Penton. Are your shoes too tight for your feet?" "A minor blister, ma'am, from the walk yesterday, nothing to fret over." "See that it doesn't fester," Mrs. Gable remarked, returning to her ledger. "A girl who cannot walk properly is a girl who cannot work, and a girl who cannot work is a girl who cannot pay." Clara stepped out onto the cold street and didn't stop running until she reached the red pillar box 3 blocks away. She pulled the letter from her stocking, it was warm from the heat of her skin, and dropped it into the slot. The sound of it hitting the metal bottom was the most satisfying, rebellious thing she had heard in months. But the underground post had a darker side. That evening, a girl named Betty from the second floor was caught. She hadn't been careful enough. A letter from a gentleman friend had fallen out of her muff in the hallway, and Mrs. Higgins had been there to catch it like a cat catching a wounded mouse. The scene in the parlor was brutal. Mrs. Gable sat like a judge at a witch trial, holding the letter aloft with 2 fingers as if it were filth. Betty was weeping, a soft, broken, rattling sound that echoed through the thin, hollow walls. "This is the language of a fallen woman," Mrs. Gable declared, her voice booming with the weight of moral outrage. "You have circumvented the sacred rules of this house to conduct a clandestine, unholy affair. You have brought the scent of the street into my parlor." He wants to marry me. He's an honest man," Betty sobbed, her face buried in her hands. "A man who writes in secret is a man who intends to betray in secret," Mrs. Gable snapped. "Your trunk will be packed and on the curb by dawn. You are no longer a boarder here, Betty. You are a warning to every girl who thinks they can hide their sins from me." Clara watched from the dark shadows of the stairs. She felt the heavy weight of her own secrets, the hidden pamphlets, the letters to Julian, the inky fingers of her soul. She realized that in this house, the only way to be free was to become a masterful liar. The forbidden correspondence was their only lifeline, but it was also the noose that could hang them. She went back to room 3C and pulled out a fresh, blank sheet of paper. Her hand was shaking, but her mind was as clear as ice. She began to write, not to Julian and not to the cause. She wrote a letter to herself. "I will not be a warning," she wrote. "I will be the one who leaves on my own terms, with my name intact and my spirit unbroken." She folded the paper and hid it, not in a drawer and not under a mattress where Mrs. Gable's passkey could find it. She hid it inside the hollow iron post of her bed. It was the only letter that would never be inspected, and the only correspondence that truly mattered. The suffragette in room 4B. In the winter of 1912, the air inside Mrs. Gable's boarding house was heavy with the smell of damp wool, coal smoke, and the lingering scent of boiled cabbage. But in the small, cramped confines of room 4B, there was a different scent, the sharp, metallic tang of revolution. It was the scent of fresh ink, straight off the illegal presses of the woman's journal. Clara had always walked past room 4B with a sense of quiet curiosity. The occupant, a woman named Miss Alice Thorne, was a librarian with spectacles that sat perpetually on the bridge of her nose and a voice that never rose above a polite, measured hum. To Mrs. Gable, Alice was the perfect boarder, invisible, obedient, and punctual. But beneath the facade of the quiet librarian lay the heart of a radical. It began with a whisper in the drafty hallway. Tuesday night, 10:15, after the bolt is thrown, room 4B, bring your own candle and your own courage. Clara arrived at the door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knocked, 3 short, sharp taps, a code she had been taught by Rose the day before. The door creaked open just an inch. Alice Thorne peered out, her eyes sharp and alert behind her lenses, scanning the shadows of the hallway for any sign of Mrs. Gable's silhouette. Come in, Clara, quickly. The floorboards in the hall are talkative tonight. Every creak sounds like a betrayal. Inside, the room was a chaotic sea of paper. Every available surface, the iron bed, the washstand, the trunk, was covered in pamphlets, posters, and handwritten manifestos. 4 other women were already there, huddled together in the dim, dancing light of a single tallow candle. The atmosphere was electric. It was the feeling of air being sucked out of a room before a violent storm. We are here, Alice began, her voice low but carrying a weight that demanded absolute attention, because the law says we are invisible. We work in the offices, we toil in the factories, we pay the taxes that build the very streets we walk upon. Yet, when the ballot box is opened, our voices are silenced by the law. We are governed by men who view us as property, or worse, as children who cannot think for themselves. She held up a yellow pamphlet. In bold, black letters that seemed to scream in the candlelight, it read, "Votes for Women." "If Mrs. Gable finds this," whispered Martha, the youngest of the group, her face pale and trembling, "she won't just evict us, she'll call the police. My father always said that suffragettes are unnatural women. He said they want to destroy the American family and everything sacred." "The family is not destroyed by equality, Martha. It is strengthened by it," Alice countered, her gaze unwavering like a soldier. "Is it natural that you work 10 hours a day for half the wage of the boy who sweeps the floors? Is it natural that Mrs. Gable can hold your life and your trunk hostage if you are 5 minutes late? We don't want to destroy the world. We want to own our place in it." Clara looked at the women in the room. They were ordinary women, typists, seamstresses, teachers. In the parlor downstairs, they were silent. They were the good girls of 23rd Street. But here, in the forbidden shadows of 4B, they were giants. "We are planning a march," Alice continued, leaning in close so that their heads nearly touched. "Next Saturday, 5th Avenue, we will wear white. We will carry banners. We will let New York see that we are not ghosts, we are citizens." "But the crowds," Clara said, her voice trembling. "I've heard the men throw stones. I've heard they spit on the women who march. The newspapers say we are hysterical." "Let them spit," Rose said from the dark corner, her jaw set in a hard, defiant line. "Their spit doesn't hurt half as much as their silence. I'm tired of being a ghost in my own life, Clara, aren't you?" Clara thought of the inky fingers at her insurance office. She thought of the invisible ledger of Mrs. Higgins. She thought of the iron bolt that locked her away like a prisoner every night at 10. "Yes," Clara whispered, feeling a sudden heat in her chest. "I am tired of being invisible." The meeting lasted until the small, cold hours of the morning. They spoke of the ballot box as if it were a holy relic, a key that would unlock every door that Mrs. Gable had shut. They discussed the tactics of the sisters in England, the hunger strikes, the chains, the fire of rebellion. Alice Thorne taught them how to fold the pamphlets into tight squares so they could be hidden in their corsets. She taught them how to answer a policeman's questions without giving away their identities. "Remember," Alice warned as they prepared to slip back to their own rooms, "the walls of this house have ears. Mrs. Gable doesn't need to be in the room to hear us. She hears through the greed of the other boarders and the suspicion of the neighbors. From this moment on, you are not just boarders, you are soldiers in a war of voices." Clara walked back to room 3C in a daze. The hallway, which had always felt like a cage, now felt like a tunnel leading to a vast, new world. She hid her yellow pamphlet under the loose floorboard next to her bed, right next to the secret letter she had written to herself. She lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. She could still hear the whispers of the ballot box echoing in the silence of the room. She realized that the rules of the house, the many suffocating rules, were only as strong as her willingness to obey them. Alice Thorne was right. The city was full of women who were tired of being ghosts, and as the sun began to rise over the tenements, casting long shadows across the floor, Clara realized that she was no longer just a girl in a boarding house. She was a woman with a secret, and that secret was the most powerful thing she had ever owned. The march was a week away. Between now and then, she would type her insurance ledgers, she would eat her stale bread, and she would smile politely at Mrs. Gable. But every time she felt the crisp paper of the pamphlet hidden against her skin, she would remember the bolt on the door was only iron, but the fire in her heart was unstoppable. Whispers through the lath and plaster. In the fragile architecture of a 1910s brownstone, privacy was a ghost that haunted the hallways but never truly entered the rooms. The walls were not barriers. They were filters made of brittle wooden lath and crumbling, dust-filled plaster, thin membranes that breathed the secrets of one woman directly into the ear of another. At number 142, Clara learned that the most intimate thing you could ever share with a total stranger was not a conversation in the parlor. It was the raw, unedited sound of their survival in the dark. It was midnight, the hour when the city's roar narrowed down to a hum. The gaslight in the hallway had been turned down to a mere blue, hissing spark to save Mrs. Gable's pennies. The house should have been silent, but a boarding house is never truly silent. It is a living, breathing symphony of small, desperate human noises. Clara lay in her iron bed, her head pressed involuntarily against the cold wallpaper of room 3D through the wood and the hollow plaster. She heard it, a rhythmic, muffled sound. Thud, thud, sob. It was the woman in the next room, a woman whose name Clara did not know, despite sharing a wall for weeks. She was a shadow who appeared at the dinner table and vanished into the gloom of the third floor. But tonight, she was undeniably real. She was crying, not the loud, performative crying of a child seeking attention, but the dry, hollow, rattling sobbing of someone who had run out of hope, but had not yet run out of pain. "Are you okay?" Clara whispered to the wall, her voice barely a breath. The sobbing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavier and more suffocating than the sound of the tears. In this house, to acknowledge a neighbor's grief was a violation of the only privacy they had left, the privacy of pretending that everything was fine. To hear was to know, and to know was to be responsible for a burden you could not carry. Clara pulled her thin, scratchy blanket tighter. She realized then that the lath and plaster were the true narrators of their lives. If she listened closely enough, she could map the entire building by its sounds. From the floor below, she heard the heavy, metallic clack of a trunk being locked, a sound of finality. Someone was leaving, perhaps in secret, perhaps in shame, fleeing before the morning rent was due. From the room directly above, the steady, rhythmic creak, creak, creak of a rocking chair, an old woman who had lived in this house since the turn of the century, rocking away the hours until the sun could justify her existence. There was no such thing as a secret in 142. If you dropped a copper coin, the girl in the room below knew your budget. If you whispered a frantic prayer, the girl next door knew the depth of your faith. If you coughed a wet, heavy cough, the whole floor feared the spread of consumption. "She's writing again," Miss Miller murmured from the darkness of their shared room. Clara could see the silhouette of her roommate sitting up, a dark shape against the gray window. "Who?" Clara asked, her voice hushed. "The girl in 3B. Listen, through the floorboards." Clara strained her ears. Scratch, 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 the frantic, desperate sound of a metal nib hitting paper with too much force. "She writes to a brother in the Navy," Miss Miller said, her voice sounding far away and hollow. "He's been gone 3 years. She thinks if she writes enough words, she can build a bridge back to the farm in Vermont. But the walls hear the letters before the postman ever does. They know she's lying to him about the glamour of the city. They know she skipped dinner tonight to buy a stamp." This was the cruelty of the 1912 brownstone. It forced an intimacy upon you that you never requested and could never escape. You knew when your neighbor was sick. You knew when she was in love, and you knew exactly when the city had finally broken her spirit. The walls were a diary that everyone could read, but no one was allowed to edit or close. Clara felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability that made her skin prickle. If she could hear them so clearly, they could hear her. Did they hear her heart hammering against her ribs when she hid the yellow suffragette pamphlets under the floorboards? Did they hear the way her breath caught in her throat when she read Julian's forbidden letters? The walls were silent witnesses, and in Mrs. Gable's house, witnesses were the most dangerous things of all. The sound came from room 3A. It was a wet, heavy, bubbling sound, the sound of lungs failing under the weight of the city's soot. "That's the third night for Bessie," Miss Miller whispered, her voice tight with fear. "If the old lady, Mrs. Gable, hears that, Bessie will be on the street by noon. Mrs. Gable doesn't allow infirmities to tarnish the reputation of her landing. A sick girl is a liability. A sick girl is a bad omen." Clara sat up, the springs of her bed shrieking in protest. "We should help her. We should bring her some hot tea or some honey. And let the walls tell the landlady that we are harboring a girl with the fever." "No, Clara, don't be a fool," Miss Miller said, her hand reaching out to grab Clara's arm. "In this house, the kindest thing you can do for someone is pretend you can't hear them dying. You listen, you ache, and you stay silent. That is the unwritten rule of the plaster. We are all alone together." Clara lay back down, but the house felt more alive than ever around her. It was a giant, wooden beast, and she was sitting deep within its ribcage. Every floorboard groan was a sigh, every steam pipe hiss was a whisper of a secret. She realized that she wasn't just in room 3C, she was surrounded by the echoes of 20 other lives, all bleeding into one another like ink on wet paper. She reached out and touched the wallpaper, a faded, peeling floral pattern that smelled of dust and dampness. She felt the wooden lath strips behind it, the very ribs of the house. "I hear you," she whispered, so softly that not even the plaster could catch the sound. "I hear all of you, I won't tell." As the first light of dawn began to gray the window, the sounds changed. The sobbing in 3D stopped, the writing in 3B ceased, the rocking chair above fell still. The house prepared its daytime mask of respectability. But Clara knew the truth. She knew that beneath the fresh paint and the starched curtains, the house was screaming. And as she rose to face another day of inky fingers and rules, she realized that the walls hadn't just taken her privacy, they had given her a burden. The burden of knowing exactly how much a woman can suffer before the plaster finally begins to crack. The vaudeville temptation. Beyond the heavy oak doors of 142 East 23rd Street lay a world that pulsed with a dangerous, electric, and intoxicating heartbeat. By night, the gray industrial city transformed into a carnival of flickering lights, a place where the air tasted of roasted peanuts, expensive tobacco, and the forbidden, sweet scent of freedom. This was the world of the vaudeville temptation, a world that every girl in Mrs. Gable's house was taught to fear as a pit of sin, but secretly longed to touch with her own hands. It began with the posters. They were splashed across the damp brick walls of the subway entrances, bold, lurid lithographs in crimson, gold, and emerald green. They promised magic, music, mystery, for the mere price of a nickel. To a girl like Clara, whose life was measured in endless typed pages and the dull taste of grey mutton stew, the 5-cent Nickelodeon was more than a theater. It was a trapdoor, an escape hatch from the crushing gravity of Victorian respectability. "It's only a show, Clara. It's just an hour of color in this grey world," Rose whispered as they walked home from the insurance office, the evening wind carrying the faint, tinny and rhythmic music of a street organ from a nearby corner. "The New Republic Theatre has a singer all the way from Paris. They say her dress is made entirely of silver sequins that catch the light like diamonds. Imagine seeing something that isn't black, brown, or navy blue for once in your life." "Mrs. Gable says the theaters are the devil's anterooms," Clara replied, though her eyes were fixed hungrily on the glowing, pulsating marquee of a nearby dance hall. "She says a girl who enters a Nickelodeon loses her soul the moment the lights go out, that the darkness hides more than just the screen." "Mrs. Gable thinks a girl loses her soul if she laughs too loud in the hallway or breathes too deeply near a man," Rose countered with a defiant, sharp toss of her head. "I'm going, Clara, Saturday night. I've saved 3 precious nickels by skipping my afternoon tea. Are you a boarder in this house, or are you a prisoner in a cage of your own making? The conflict gnawed at Clara all through the long, grueling week. In the 1910s, a woman's morality was geographically defined. A good girl was found in the church, the office, or the supervised parlor. A dangerous girl was found in the dance hall or the darkened, velvet rows of a vaudeville house. To seek joy was to court ruin. Yet as she sat in room 3C, listening to the muffled, hopeless sobbing through the thin plaster walls, Clara felt a desperate, primal need for light, for music, for anything that didn't smell like floor wax and old letters. Saturday arrived like a fever. The moral code of the house felt like a physical weight. A corset tightened so hard around her spirit that she could barely draw a clean breath. Mrs. Gable sat in her usual spot in the foyer, her eyes scanning every girl who exited for the telltale signs of vanity, a bit of forbidden lace, a daring dab of rouge, or a look of unseemly, restless excitement. Clara and Rose slipped out under the thin guise of attending a lecture at the public library. Their hearts hammered against their ribs like trapped birds as they turned the corner and dived into the neon-lit, chaotic, and beautiful madness of 14th Street. The theater was a cavern of wonders. The air was thick with the smell of warm popcorn, expensive cigar smoke, and cheap, flowery perfume. The walls were draped in heavy red velvet that had seen better days but still shimmered under the flickering gaslight. When the projector began to whir, a rhythmic, mechanical, and hypnotic sound like a giant iron cicada, and the first flickering images appeared on the screen, Clara forgot the inky fingers. She forgot the unpaid rent. She forgot the iron bolt. On the screen, a woman was riding a white horse across a vast, open, and sun-drenched desert. She wasn't typing insurance ledgers. She wasn't mending frayed hems. She was flying across the world. For a nickel, Clara was flying with her. But the moral danger was never far away in the dark. In the rows of seats, men shifted in the shadows, their gazes lingering too long on the solitary women in the audience. A hand brushed Clara's shoulder in the gloom, a touch that felt like a hot iron of warning. She realized then why the rules existed. The city offered joy, yes, but it offered it at the terrifying price of safety. "Let's go to the dance hall next door," Rose whispered as they exited the theater, her eyes bright with a feverish, uncontrollable energy. "Just for one song, I want to hear the ragtime band. I want to feel the floor move." The dance hall was a different beast altogether. It was a sea of frantic movement, a blur of spinning silk skirts and stomping leather boots. The music was loud, syncopated, and low, the kind of music that made your blood run hot and your heart forget its manners. This was the vice the preachers screamed about from their pulpits. It was the vice of forgetting who you were. It was the vice of wanting more than your humble station allowed. Clara stood at the very edge of the floor, watching a girl from a nearby boarding house dance with a total stranger. The girl's hat was crooked, her face was flushed with a wild heat, and for a fleeting moment, she looked absolutely, terrifyingly happy. "We have to go," Clara said suddenly, a wave of cold, icy panic washing over her. She saw a man in a checkered suit watching them from the bar, a slow, predatory, and knowing smile on his face. "Rose, it's 9:40. If we aren't back by 10, the bolt will slide home, and if Mrs. Gable smells the tobacco or the street air on our coats, we are finished." The walk back was a blur of terror. They ran through the dark shadows of the alleys, away from the music, away from the electric lights, and back toward the suffocating safety of 23rd Street. As they reached the stone steps of number 142, the absolute silence of the boarding house felt like a physical slap in the face. Mrs. Gable was waiting. She didn't speak a word. She simply stood by the sideboard, her nose twitching like a rabbit's as they brushed past her. She was smelling the city on them, the popcorn, the ragtime, and the rebellion. Clara reached her room and collapsed onto the bed, her heart still racing from the dance hall music. She was safe behind the bolt. She was back in the cage. But as she closed her eyes, she didn't see the rules or the landlady. She saw the woman on the white horse, riding toward a horizon where there were no walls, no curfews, and no one to tell her that joy was a sin. A letter from the farm. In the bustling, ironclad, and relentless heart of Manhattan, Clara Penton often felt like a seedling uprooted and tossed into a violent storm. But nothing reminded her of her own fragility more than the arrival of a letter from the farm in Ohio. In Mrs. Gable's house, mail was usually a source of sharp gossip, but for Clara, it was a source of heavy gravity. It was a weight that pulled her backward, across the jagged Appalachian mountains, to the muddy fields and the silent, judging eyes of her kin. The envelope sat on the mahogany sideboard in the foyer like a cold stone. It was addressed in her mother's cramped, laborious and shaking handwriting, a script shaped by decades of milking stubborn cows and kneading heavy dough, not by the light, mechanical touch of a Remington typewriter. Clara waited until the evening lamp was lit in room 3C. She waited until the house settled into its nightly groan before she dared to break the wax seal. Image, a young woman sitting on a narrow iron bed, illuminated by the flicker of a single candle, holding a worn letter with a look of intense longing and suffocating guilt. "My dearest Clara," the letter began. The ink was faded in places, as if the pen itself were tired of the distance. "The harvest is nearly done, but your father's back is not what it used to be. It bends lower with every sunset. Every night at the supper table, he looks at your empty chair and says absolutely nothing, but I see the way his hands shake when he prays over the bread. He still calls the city a Golgotha of sin and noise. He worries, Clara. He worries every hour that you have forgotten the narrow path we walked together." The words felt like a physical, suffocating pressure against Clara's chest. In the city, she fought every day to be a new woman, independent, vocal and self-sufficient, but to the farm, she was simply a daughter who had abandoned her sacred duty. The gravity of rural roots was a silent, invisible tether. It told her that her independence was a form of hollow selfishness, that her desire for a city wage was a betrayal of the very land that had fed her ancestors for generations. "Bad news from home?" Miss Miller asked softly from across the small room. She was mending a stocking, her needle moving with the steady, mechanical rhythm of a heartbeat. "Just the farm," Clara replied, her voice thick with a sudden, uncontrollable emotion. "My mother says the winter is coming early this year. She says the preacher asked about me in front of the whole congregation. They think I'm living in luxury or in vice. They don't understand that I'm just typing. They don't see the ink. They only see the distance." "They never understand," Miss Miller said, her gaze remaining fixed on her work. "To them, the city is a beast that swallows girls whole and spits out husks. My father didn't speak a single word to me for 5 years after I left Virginia. He died thinking I was a fallen woman simply because I wanted to own my own life instead of owning a husband's plow. The guilt is the rent we pay for our freedom, Clara." Clara looked at the letter again, her eyes blurring. "Your cousin Martha has married the Miller boy from the next valley. They have a fine, sturdy house near the creek. Your father says there is still time for you to come home before the winter snow blocks the pass for good. There is no shame in returning, Clara. The city is no place for a Christian girl to grow old and lonely." No shame in returning. The phrase was a lie, a beautiful, tempting lie. Clara knew that if she returned now, she would be returning as a shattered failure. She would be the girl who couldn't make it in the roar of New York, the girl who came back with inky fingers, a hollow chest, and eyes that had seen too much. The fear of failure was a sharper, more painful goad than even the strictest rules of Mrs. Gable. It kept her in the stenography pool. It kept her in the communal washroom. It kept her typing until her vision blurred into gray. The conflict was a constant, throbbing ache. She loved the smell of fresh hay and the absolute silence of the Ohio nights, but she also loved the electric roar of the subway and the feeling of a hardened paycheck in her hand. She was caught between two worlds, two city for the farm and two country for the city. Image, a split-screen visual. One side shows a dark, crowded New York street. The other shows an open, golden wheat field under a vast, silent sky. She walked to the small, grimy window of room 3C outside. She could see only the cold brick wall of the neighboring building. There was no horizon here, no creek, no harvest, just the relentless, mechanical, and uncaring pulse of Manhattan. "I can't go back," she whispered to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. "If I go back now, I'll never leave again. I'll become like these walls, fixed, unmoving, and slowly crumbling." She sat at her small, wobbly table and took out a clean sheet of paper. She began to write her reply. She didn't write about the stale bread. She didn't write about the 10 o'clock bolt. And she certainly didn't write about the forbidden suffragette pamphlets hidden beneath her feet. She wrote about the grandeur of the insurance building. She wrote about the respectability of the other boarders. She wrote a beautiful, shining, and necessary lie. "I am doing well, Mother." Her pen flew across the page with a desperate speed. "The city is loud, but I am safe and held in high regard. Tell Father I am saving my coins for a grand future. I am a part of something big here, something that matters." As she folded the letter, a single, heavy tear fell onto the paper, blurring the ink on the word safe. She didn't wipe it away. Let it be a secret message, a single drop of the farm's rain lost in the city's dust. She realized then that the wicked city hadn't taken her soul, it had simply made it more complex. She was no longer a simple girl of the soil, she was a woman of the concrete and the gaslight. The guilt would always be there, a ghost sitting silently at her dinner table, but the fear of failure would be her fuel for the years to come. She blew out the candle and lay down in the dark. In her dreams, the sound of the New York trolley transformed into the rustling of dry corn stalks in the autumn wind. She was walking home, but when she reached the farmhouse door, she found she no longer had a key that fit the lock. The gravity was losing its pull. She was falling, not into sin, as her father feared, but into the vast, unknown depths of herself. The influenza shadow. The shadow did not fall all at once. It crept into 142 East 23rd Street on the hem of a wet coat and the breath of a tired commuter. It was the winter of 1918. The Great War was ending, but a new, invisible enemy had breached the borders of New York. In the cramped, shared spaces of Mrs. Gable's house, where 10 women shared a wash basin and 20 shared a table, the influenza shadow was not just a medical crisis, it was a test of the soul. It began with Bessie in room 3A. It was a cough, dry, persistent, and hollow, that echoed through the lath and plaster walls. At first, the other boarders ignored it. They tucked their heads under their blankets and prayed for silence. But by the second night, the cough had turned into a rattle, a sound like stones shaking in a tin can. "She has the Spanish lady," Miss Miller whispered one morning, her face as pale as the sheets she was mending. "I saw her in the hallway. Her face was a strange, dusky purple. Her eyes were glassy. Mrs. Gable will have her out on the street by nightfall if she finds out." Clara felt a cold knot of terror in her stomach. In a boarding house, your neighbor's breath is your own. There was no social distance in 1918. There was only the communal mirror, the shared spoon, and the narrow hallway where you brushed shoulders with death every morning. The house became a place of frantic self-preservation. Girls began to wear cheesecloth masks soaked in camphor. They avoided the dining room. They scrubbed their hands with lye until the skin cracked and bled. Friendship, already a fragile thing in a house of strangers, began to dissolve. To look at a friend was to look at a carrier. "We should check on her," Clara said, standing at the door of 3C. "I haven't heard her move in hours." "Are you mad?" Miss Miller snapped, her voice trembling. "If you go in there, you bring that fever back to this room. You bring it to me. We are strangers here, Clara. We don't owe each other our lives." This was the influenza shadow. It turned the boarding house into a collection of isolated islands. But as the sun set and the sound of Bessie's labored breathing became a desperate, bubbling gasp, Clara realized that self-preservation felt remarkably like cowardice. She waited until Mrs. Gable had finished her nightly round. She took a cup of water and a clean rag, and she slipped into room 3A. The room was a furnace. The heat coming off Bessie's body was a physical wall. The girl was delirious, her fingers clawing at the air as if trying to catch a breath that wasn't there. Clara sat by the bed and pressed the damp rag to Bessie's forehead. Hiss, gasp, rattle. Throughout the night, the boarding house was a landscape of fear. From the rooms below, Clara heard the sounds of trunks being packed, girls fleeing the house, hopping to outrun the shadow. From the room above, she heard the frantic scrubbing of floors. But in 3A, there was only the steady, rhythmic battle for air. "Why are you here?" Clara looked up. Miss Miller was standing in the doorway, a mask tied around her face, holding a bottle of eucalyptus oil. "I couldn't stay in the other room," Clara whispered, her eyes stinging with fatigue. "I couldn't listen to her die alone." Miss Miller didn't speak. She walked over, saturated a cloth with the oil, and began to rub it on Bessie's chest. For the first time, the house of strangers felt like a home. They weren't sisters by blood. They weren't even friends by choice. They were simply two women who refused to let the shadow win without a fight. By dawn, the house was strangely quiet. 5 girls had fled in the night. Mrs. Gable stood at the top of the stairs, a handkerchief pressed to her nose, her eyes filled with a rare naked fear. She looked at Clara and Miss Miller emerging from the sick room. "You have compromised this house," the landlady said, her voice muffled by the cloth. "You have brought the plague into the common air." "The plague was already here, Mrs. Gable," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady. "It came in through the door you lock every night. You can evict us if you like, but Bessie is sleeping now. Her fever has broken." Mrs. Gable looked at the two women, their hair disheveled, their clothes wrinkled, their eyes red-rimmed. She saw the inky fingers of Clara's hands, now raw from lye and oil. For a long, silent minute, the rules of the house hung in the balance. The moral code of the landlady met the human code of the tenants. "Stay in your rooms," Mrs. Gable finally whispered. "I will have the maid bring up broth, but if a single other girl falls ill, God help you." Clara went back to room 3C and collapsed. She was exhausted, terrified, and likely infected. But as she looked at Miss Miller, she realized that the architecture of restriction had failed. The walls hadn't kept the sickness out, but they also hadn't kept the compassion in. The influenza shadow continued to haunt the city for months. Thousands died. But in the small, narrow rooms of 142 East 23rd Street, a new rule was written, a rule that wasn't in Mrs. Gable's ledger. It was the rule that in a house of strangers, the only way to survive the darkness is to hold the lamp for someone else. Clara closed her eyes and slept. For the first time since she arrived in New York, the ticking of the hallway clock didn't sound like a countdown. It sounded like a heartbeat. Missing at roll call. In the meticulous, clockwork world of Mrs. Gable, every single soul was accounted for by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. There was a roll call of boots on the stairs at dawn, a roll call of spoons clinking against china at the breakfast table, and a roll call of heavy iron keys hanging on the brass hooks by the door. But in the winter of 1913, New York was a city of hungry shadows, a city that swallowed women whole, leaving behind nothing but a cold draft and a hollow, haunting silence. It began on a gray Tuesday morning. The breakfast bell had rung its usual insistent copper chime. The boarders had filed down from their rooms, their faces pale masks of morning exhaustion and city soot. But chair number 12, the seat belonging to a quiet, delicate girl named Elena, was empty. At first, there was only a small ripple of curiosity among the girls. Perhaps she overslept after a long night, someone whispered behind a napkin. Perhaps she took an early shift at the textile mill, another suggested, trying to convince herself. But as the minutes turned into a full hour, the curiosity hardened into a cold, sharp dread that settled in the pit of Clara's stomach. Elena was never late. Elena was a girl of strict habits, a girl who lived her life by the exact timing of the bolt and the curfew. Mrs. Gable stood at the head of the long table, her eyes fixed on the empty chair with a look that wasn't worry. It was offense. To be missing was to be disorderly. To vanish without notice was to be fundamentally inconvenient. "Miss Penton," Mrs. Gable barked, her voice cutting through the clatter of forks like a blade. "You share a landing with Miss Elena. Did you see her depart this house at the break of dawn?" "No, ma'am," Clara replied, her heart starting to race against her ribs. "I didn't hear a single sound from her room. Her door was still closed when I went to the wash basin at 6. Mrs. Gable turned to the housemaid, her face a mask of granite. "Get the passkey. We shall see if Miss Elena has decided to ignore the morning summons of this respectable house." The procession up the stairs was heavy and silent. Clara followed at a distance, her hand gripping the banister until her knuckles turned white. The mystery of the empty bed was unfolding in the narrow, dim hallway of the 3rd floor. Mrs. Gable inserted the iron key, the lock groaned in protest, the door swung open with a slow, agonizing creak. The room was perfect. It was terrifyingly perfect. The bed was made, the hospital corners sharp enough to cut paper. The washstand was dry and spotless, but Alina's trunk sat open in the center of the floor, and inside, her few meager belongings were scattered as if she had been interrupted in the middle of a frantic, impossible choice. One shoe sat lonely by the window, its twin was nowhere to be found. "She's gone," whispered Martha, peering over Clara's shoulder with wide, frightened eyes. "She's just vanished into thin air." "Nonsense," Mrs. Gable snapped, though her hand trembled slightly as she touched the cold, untouched sheets of the bed. "Girls in this city do not simply vanish. She has likely run off with a man of ill repute, or she has met with an accident of her own making. Either way, she has forfeited her security deposit, and she has forfeited her place in this house." The cold, sharp reality hit Clara like a physical blow to the chest. In 1913, if a woman vanished, the first suspicion was not foul play, it was moral failure. The city was a vast, grinding iron machine, and Alina was a small, easily replaceable gear. There would be no police sirens, there would be no sensational headlines, there would be no search parties in the dark alleys. To the authorities, a missing boarder was just another girl who had found the wickedness of the city more attractive than the rules of a brownstone house. "We should call the precinct immediately," Clara said, her voice rising in a tone of desperation she didn't know she possessed. She could be hurt. She could be lying in a hospital ward, unidentified. "And have the police trampling through my respectable foyer, bringing scandal to my doorstep." Mrs. Gable turned, her eyes like flint in the shadows. "I think not, Miss Penton. If Miss Alina has met a dark fate, it began the moment she stepped outside that door without a proper chaperone. This house is responsible for your safety inside. The city is entirely responsible for your ruin outside." By noon, the erasure had begun. Alina's belongings were being packed into a wooden crate by the maid. Her room was being scrubbed with harsh lye to remove the faint scent of her lavender soap. By evening, a room for rent sign was back in the front window. It was as if Alina had never existed, as if her name had never been written in the ledger. Clara sat in room 3C that night, staring at the thin wall she shared with the now empty room. She thought of how easily her own name could be scratched out of the record. If she didn't return from the insurance office tomorrow, if the trolley jumped the tracks in the rain, if she simply vanished into the shadows of the Bowery, would anyone mourn her, or would they simply wonder who would sit in her chair at the dinner table? "She won't come back, Clara," Miss Miller said from the darkness. She was sitting by the window, watching the rain streak the glass like tears. "I've seen it happen before. A girl gets tired of the typing, tired of the grey mutton, tired of the endless rules. She thinks she sees a shortcut to a better life. And the city is full of men who specialize in offering shortcuts that lead to nowhere." "You truly think she ran away?" Clara asked, hoping for a reason to be angry rather than afraid. "I think the city happened to her," Miss Miller replied, her voice heavy with a terrible ancient wisdom. "Maybe she's in a better place, or maybe she's just another ghost trapped in the lath and plaster. Either way, don't be the next one missing at roll call. Keep your eyes on the pavement and keep your hand firmly on your purse." Clara looked at the empty bed in her mind. She realized then that the many rules of the house weren't just about control. They were a frantic, pathetic attempt to keep the chaos of the city at bay. But the chaos was stronger than any iron bolt. It could reach through the window, it could wait patiently at the corner, it could pull a girl right out of her shoes and leave her chair empty by breakfast. She reached into her apron pocket and touched the iron key to her own room. It felt heavier than it had that morning. It was no longer just a key, it was an anchor. In a city where a woman could vanish without a single whisper, the rules were the only thing that proved she was still there. Clara closed her eyes and prayed, not for Alina's return, for she knew that was a hopeless dream, but for her own soul. She prayed that if she ever disappeared, she would leave more behind than a single shoe and a dry wash basin. The clock in the hall struck 11. The house was silent. The roll call was finished. And for the first time since she arrived in New York, Clara Penton was truly, deeply, and irrevocably afraid of the dark. The landlady's ledger. November arrived in New York not as a gentle season, but as a calculated predator. It began with a biting, salt-laden wind that whipped off the East River, cutting through the thin, threadbare wool of factory coats and turning the city's collective breath into a white, ghostly fog. Inside number 142 East 23rd Street, the winter chill was not just a matter of the thermometer, it was a matter of the ledger. Mrs. Gable's ledger was a massive, leather-bound volume that lived permanently on the front desk like a sacred, terrible text. To the boarders, it was the Book of Fate. It recorded every penny owed, every fine for a 5-minute late arrival, and every agonizing cent spent on the extra coal allowance. Clara stood before the desk, her numb fingers tucked deep into her sleeves to hide their uncontrollable trembling. The announcement had been posted that morning. Pinned to the wall like a warrant, due to the rising cost of anthracite coal, room rents will increase by 50 cents per week, effective immediately. Failure to pay will result in the immediate loss of heating privileges. 50 cents. To a woman strolling down Fifth Avenue, it was the mere price of a pair of silk ribbons. To Clara, it was 5 days of skipped lunches. It was the difference between a full stomach and a hollow, gnawing ache that lived permanently in the center of her chest. I wasn't expecting an increase until January, Mrs. Gable, Clara said, her voice sounding thin, brittle, and small in the drafty foyer. The coal barges do not consult my expectations, Miss Penton, nor do they consult yours, Mrs. Gable replied without looking up, her pen scratching across the ledger with a sound like a small, trapped animal clawing at a wooden door. The furnace is a hungry iron beast. If you wish to sleep in a room that doesn't freeze the water in your wash basin to solid ice, you will find the coin, or someone else will. Clara looked down at her boots. The leather was worn to the thickness of paper. The soles were already separating from the uppers. For 6 months, she had been saving every spare penny for a new winter coat, a heavy, lined garment she had seen in the window of a shop on 14th Street. Her current coat was a relic from Ohio, a threadbare thing that let the New York wind in as if it were made of delicate lace. This was the financial desperation of the independent girl. It was the internal struggle of choosing between a warm coat or a roof overhead. If she bought the coat, she would be warm on the street, but freezing in her own bed. If she paid the rent hike, she would have a roof, but she would likely catch the pneumonia before Christmas arrived. I will pay, Clara whispered, her pride tasting like ash. She walked up the stairs, each step feeling as if she were dragging a lead weight tied to her ankles. In room 3C, the air was already turning sharp and metallic. The single, rusted radiator in the corner hissed and sputtered, giving off a sharp smell of steam, but very little actual heat. "She's raised it again, hasn't she?" Miss Miller asked from the shadows. She was sitting on her bed, wrapped in 3 different mismatched shawls, her fingers blue-tinged, as she tried to thread a needle in the dim light. 50 cents, Clara said, sitting down heavily on her own cot. "I have to give up the coat, Martha. I have to stay in this rag for another year." Miss Miller stopped sewing and looked at her. Her eyes were hollow, rimmed with the red, heavy fatigue of a woman who had spent 20 winters in the drafty rooms of New York boarding houses. "The ledger always wins, Clara. Mrs. Gable doesn't sell rooms, she sells survival. And survival in this city is priced just high enough to keep you from ever saving enough to leave. It is a trap made of ink and coal." The night was a long, shivering ordeal. Clara lay in bed with her coat draped over her blanket, her feet wrapped in a flannel petticoat. She could hear the winter chill rattling the windowpane, a thin, whistling sound that seemed to mock her poverty. She thought of her father's letter. There is no shame in returning, but returning meant admitting that the ledger had broken her. It meant admitting that New York had taken her coins, her warmth, and her pride, and given her nothing but inky fingers and a cough in return. Shivo, shivo, shivo. Throughout the house, the sound of coughing began to rise, a low, communal, and haunting chorus of the cold. The women of 142 were all making the same impossible calculation. Some would skip breakfast for a week. Some would walk 3 miles to work to save the nickel trolley fare. Some, like the girl in 3B, would take on evening work at the laundry, breathing in scalding steam until midnight just to afford a bucket of coal. "I'm going to do it," Clara said into the dark, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm going to ask for more hours at the insurance office. I'll type the maritime logs. I'll stay until the gaslights are turned off by the watchman." "You'll burn your eyes out, child," Miss Miller warned from the darkness. "Better to be blind than to freeze to death in this room," Clara replied. The next morning, the ledger was waiting. Clara walked past it, her chin tilted high in a mask of defiance. She saw Mrs. Gable blotting a fresh entry, another girl's name, another 50 cents added to the profit. The landlady didn't even look up. To her, they weren't women with dreams, they were columns of figures. They were assets to be managed and liabilities to be discarded. Clara stepped out into the November air. The wind hit her like a physical blow, tearing through her thin coat. She shivered, her teeth clashing together, but she didn't turn back. She walked toward the trolley, her mind fixed on the maritime logs and the extra coins she would earn. The winter would be long, the ledger would be cruel, but as she gripped her purse, Clara felt a spark of something that wasn't cold. It was the heat of a quiet, stubborn rage. Mrs. Gable could hike the rent, the coal could turn to ash, but they would not freeze the ambition out of her heart. Not today, not ever. Breaking the corset. By the spring of 1914, the air in New York was no longer just filled with the heavy soot of industry. It was charged with the invisible, pulsating electricity of change. In the cramped, airless rooms of 142 East 23rd Street, the new woman was no longer just a scandalous headline in the morning papers. She was a girl looking into a cracked, silvered mirror, deciding that she had finally had enough of the past. Clara Penton realized that a revolution did not always require a parade or a banner. Sometimes, it only required a pair of sharp sewing scissors and an even sharper tongue. The first act of rebellion was deeply physical. The corset, that rigid, punishing cage of whalebone steel and lace, had been Clara's constant, suffocating companion since she was a mere girl of 14. It was designed to mold her soft body into a specific, unnatural shape, to restrict her very breath, and to remind her, with every sharp poke in the ribs, that a woman's place in the world was defined by her constraints. One humid, rebellious Tuesday morning, Clara stood over her narrow bed and simply refused to pull the laces. She felt the sudden, terrifying and dizzying lightness of her own lungs. Inhale, exhale, inhale. It was a sensation of pure, unadulterated freedom. Without the corset, her dress hung differently. Her posture was less ladylike and more human. It was a small act of rebellion that no one on the street would see, but she would feel it with every triumphant step she took toward the insurance office. "You look dangerously loose, Clara," Miss Miller whispered, her eyes wide with shock as she watched Clara button her bodice without the usual struggle. "If Mrs. Gable catches even a glimpse of your natural silhouette, she'll think you've joined a traveling circus, or something far worse. Let her think what she wants, Martha. My ribs belong to me, not to the house rules or the ghost of Queen Victoria," Clara replied, her voice firmer and more resonant than it had ever been in that house. But the rebellion did not stop at the waistline. The next target was the hair, the crowning glory that was actually a heavy chain. For years, Clara had spent 30 precious minutes every single morning pinning her long, dark tresses into a complicated, aching Gibson girl pile. It was a crown of societal expectations that weighed on her neck like lead. With a pair of heavy sewing shears, Clara did the unthinkable. Snip, snip, snip. The long, dark curls fell to the dusty floorboards like shed skin. When she was finished, her hair barely brushed her jawline. It was a bob, the unmistakable mark of the radical. She felt a pound lighter, she felt 10 years faster, she felt like she could outrun the wind. "My God," Miss Miller gasped, clutching her throat as if she were the one losing her hair. "You've ruined your chances, you'll never find a respectable husband now." "I didn't cut it for a husband, Martha. I cut it for the wind and for my own peace," Clara said, running her fingers through the short, jagged ends with a smile. The true test, however, came at the front desk, the altar of Mrs. Gable's authority. When Clara descended the stairs that morning, no corset, bobbed hair, and a skirt she had shortened by 2 daring inches to show her ankles, the foyer went deathly, terrifyingly silent. Mrs. Gable rose from her chair like a storm cloud gathering over a gray horizon. She looked at Clara's hair. She looked at the scandalous glimpse of black stocking. She looked at the steady defiance in Clara's eyes. "Miss Penton," the landlady began, her voice a low, dangerous rattle that vibrated in the small space. You have appeared in my foyer looking like a common street urchin. This is a house of absolute respectability. We do not harbor women who mutilate their crowning glory or dress like harlots from the Bowery. In the past, Clara would have looked at her worn boots. She would have apologized. She would have slunk back upstairs to fix the shame. But today, the lack of whalebone meant she could breathe, and the lack of long hair meant she could see the world clearly. "The world is changing, Mrs. Gable," Clara said, stepping closer to the desk until she could see the ink stains on the landlady's fingers. "The hair is gone, the corset is in the bin, and my skirt is short so that I can walk faster to the job that pays your rent. If my respectability is tied only to a yard of fabric or a hairpin, then it was never worth having in the first place." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Clara had ever heard in Manhattan. The other boarders held their collective breath. Mrs. Higgins, watching like a vulture from the parlor, actually dropped her knitting. For a brief, glorious moment, the architecture of restriction trembled. Mrs. Gable's face turned a deep, mottled purple. "You will be fined $1 for your insolence, and you will be given exactly 1 week to correct your appearance, or you will find your trunk on the sidewalk. I will not have my house turned into a den of radicals." "Keep the dollar, Mrs. Gable, but the hair stays short," Clara said, her heart hammering not with fear, but with the pure, electric thrill of the daily rebellion. She walked out the front door without waiting for a single word of rebuttal. On the street, the sun felt warmer on the back of her neck. She noticed other women, a shop girl with a shorter hem, a typist with a simpler, lighter hat. They were everywhere, small, scattered sparks of change waiting for a breeze to turn them into a fire. She reached the office and sat at her Remington. Clack, clack, clack. Her fingers moved with a new, liberated agility. She wasn't just typing insurance logs anymore, she was typing her own secret manifesto. Every small act was a stitch being ripped out of the old, suffocating world. That evening, when she returned to 142, she found a small, folded note tucked under her door. It wasn't from a beau, and it wasn't from the landlady. It was from Martha Miller. "I cut mine too, Clara. It's all in the wash basin. Please, help me even out the back. I want to look as brave as you." Clara smiled in the dark. The corset was broken, the hair was shed, and the whispers through the lath and plaster were finally changing their tune. They weren't whispering about grief anymore, they were whispering about the future. The final notice. The morning air of 1915 didn't smell of old coal and boiled cabbage. It smelled of gunpowder, fresh newspaper ink, and change. On the heavy mahogany sideboard of 142 East 23rd Street, resting right atop the dreaded ledger, sat a single sharp slip of yellow paper. It wasn't a comforting letter from Ohio. It wasn't a secret poem from Julian. It was a final notice. Clara Penton's week of grace was officially up. The ultimatum delivered by Mrs. Gable to correct her radical appearance, wear a corset once more, and cease her political agitation with the suffragettes, had reached its cold, calculated, and final deadline. The house was unnervingly, terrifyingly silent as Clara descended the creaking stairs. The other boarders watched from the deep shadows of their open doorways, their eyes filled with a painful mixture of pity, curiosity, and raw terror. In this house, to challenge the landlady was to challenge the only roof over your head. It was more than an argument. It was a form of social suicide. Mrs. Gable was waiting. She stood behind the front desk like a gargoyle carved from shadow and bitterness. Her hands were folded tightly over the ledger, the book that held the lives of 60 women in its ink. "The clock has struck 8, Miss Penton. I see that your hair is still mutilated and short. Your skirts are still scandalous. And my sources tell me you were seen at the Fifth Avenue March on Saturday, carrying a banner of pure rebellion." "I was not carrying a banner of rebellion, Mrs. Gable," Clara said, her voice echoing through the hollow, high-ceilinged foyer with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I was carrying a banner of justice. There is a vast difference, even if you refuse to see it." "Not in this house, there isn't," Mrs. Gable snapped, her voice like the cracking of dry wood. She reached under the desk and produced a heavy iron key, the master key to Clara's trunk. "You have chosen the chaos of the world over your own reputation. You have chosen the street over the safety of respectability. Therefore, the street is exactly where you shall go this morning." This was the final stand. Clara felt the familiar, cold prickle of fear at the thought of homelessness, but beneath it, there was something brand new, a solid, unbreakable, and warm floor of certainty. For years, she had lived her life by the many rules. She had feared the nightly bolt. She had tiptoed through the hallways like a thief. She had mended her dreams over and over to fit the threadbare reality of a boarder's life. But as she looked at that yellow notice, she realized that the cage only had power as long as the bird was afraid to fly. You think respectability is found in the tightness of a corset and the timing of a curfew, Clara said, her voice rising now, filling every crack and corner between the lath and the plaster. But respectability is not something you grant me, Mrs. Gable. It is not a gift you give. It is something I own by birthright. You can lock your door at 10. You can hike the rent until we starve. You can police our letters, our friendships, and our hair. But you cannot, you will never, own the thoughts in our heads. A sharp gasp went up from the landing above. Mrs. Higgins, sitting in the parlor, clutched her crucifix as if warding off a demon. No one in the 20-year history of the house had ever dared to speak to the landlady in such a manner. "Pack your things," Mrs. Gable whispered, her face turning a ghastly, pale and mottled gray. "You have exactly 1 hour. If your trunk is not on the sidewalk by 9 o'clock, I shall call the police to remove you as a trespasser." "Don't bother with the police," Clara replied with a cold smile. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small leather purse, the one filled with the hard-earned extra coins from typing the maritime logs until midnight. She slammed it onto the ledger with a heavy metallic thud. "Here is the rent for the week. I am leaving this house, Mrs. Gable, but I am not being evicted. I am resigning from your world." She turned toward the stairs, where the other women stood huddled like frightened sheep. "Martha, Rose, Bessie, how long are we going to live in fear of a bolt that we can slide ourselves? The city is vast. There are apartments in the village, places where we can share the rent as sisters, places where we don't need a chaperone to drink a cup of tea or read a book." The silence was absolute. Clara felt a moment of agonizing, heart-stopping doubt. Was she truly alone? Had she broken the corset only to find herself standing in the cold, isolated by her own bravery? Then a floorboard creaked loudly. Miss Miller stepped forward from the shadows of the second floor. She was holding a small, battered, and much-repaired suitcase. "My trunk is already packed, Clara. I'm tired of the grey mutton. I'm tired of the whispers through the walls. I'm coming with you." Then Rose stepped forward. Then Bessie. One by one, the good girls of 23rd Street began to descend the stairs, their footsteps sounding like a drumbeat. It was a silent, magnificent mutiny. They weren't just leaving a house, they were leaving an entire era of shadows. Mrs. Gable watched in horror, her mouth hanging open, her authority dissolving like sugar in the rain. The ledger, the book of fate, lay forgotten and open on the desk, its columns of figures finally revealed as nothing more than ink on paper. For the first time, those figures had become human beings. Clara walked to the front door. She didn't look at the sideboard. She didn't look at the faded, floral wallpaper. She reached for the heavy iron bolt, the same bolt that had terrified her for years. With a sharp, loud, and final metallic clack, she slid it back herself. She opened the door wide. The morning sun flooded the foyer, blindingly brilliant and warm. The roar of New York rushed in, the ringing of trolley bells, the shouting of vegetable vendors, the relentless, beautiful, and terrifying noise of the future. "The door is wide open, Mrs. Gable," Clara said, looking back over her shoulder for the very last time. "You might want to close it. The world is coming in, and it's not asking for permission." She stepped out onto the stone steps. Her boots were worn, her hair was short, her fingers were permanently stained with the ink of labor. But as she walked down toward the sidewalk, her head held high, Clara Penton realized she was finally, irrevocably free. The gaslight ambitions of her youth were gone, replaced by the blinding, electric light of her own making. She didn't look back, she didn't need to. The final notice was blowing away in the wind, just a scrap of yellow paper lost in the vast, reaching and hopeful shadows of the city. Beyond the doorstep. The year was 1922, and the New York that Clara Penton now traversed with such confidence would have been entirely unrecognizable to the terrified girl who had arrived a decade earlier with a single wooden trunk and a heart full of tremors. The gaslight, that flickering, yellow and unreliable ghost of the 19th century, had been decisively and finally snuffed out, replaced by the cold, white, and relentless glare of the electric bulb. The world was no longer measured by the petty ticking of a landlady's pocket watch. It was now measured by the frantic, syncopated beat of jazz and the raw, mechanical roar of the internal combustion engine. Clara stood on the corner of 42nd Street, her heavy winter coat unbuttoned in the crisp air, her hair a sleek, professional and dark bob tucked neatly under a daring cloche hat. She was no longer a boarder at number 142. She lived in a shared apartment in the heart of Greenwich Village, a place where the walls were still thin, but the conversations were thick with art, radical politics, and the infinite possibilities of the future. The architecture of restriction had finally crumbled, replaced by a city that seemed to be reaching for the stars in a fever of cold steel and shimmering glass. She looked down at her fingers. They were still stained with ink, but it was a different, more powerful kind of ink now. She was no longer a lowly stenographer typing maritime insurance logs in a basement. She was a copywriter for a rising advertising agency, a true new woman in a new era, selling dreams and desires to a generation that had survived a great war and a deadly plague, and was now hungry for every beautiful thing the world had to offer. The transition had not been easy. The roaring 20s were loud and glamorous, yes, but they were also complicated and cold. The newfound freedoms, the right to vote, the right to work, the right to walk the crowded streets unchaperoned, came with their own set of heavy shadows. The city was faster, but it was also more indifferent. The communal support of the boarding house, with its shared miseries and whispered secrets through the lath and plaster, had been traded for the glittering, solitary, and sometimes lonely independence of the modern apartment. "Do you ever miss it, Clara, even just a little?" The question came from Martha Miller. They were sitting together in a small, smoke-filled cafe in the village, the smell of strong coffee and Turkish cigarettes providing a sharp, welcome contrast to the boiled cabbage and dust of their past life. Martha was wearing rouge on her cheeks, her skirt ended daringly at her knees, and she worked as a head bookkeeper for a silent film studio. "Miss the grey mutton stew, or the heavy iron bolt at 10 o'clock, Clara smiled, but her eyes were pensive and far away. "No, I don't miss the cage, Martha, never, but sometimes I miss the way we held the lamp for each other in the absolute dark. In this new, electric world, everyone has their own bright light, but no one seems to be looking at anyone else anymore." This was the paradox of the 1920s. They had broken the corset, but they were still learning how to breathe deeply in the open air. The final notice had been served to the old, Victorian world, but the new world was still busy writing its own chaotic rules. Clara thought of Mrs. Gable sometimes. The boarding house at number 142 was still standing, but it was a relic, a tomb for a way of life that was rapidly evaporating into history. Rumor had it that the house was being converted into modern bachelor flats with individual bathrooms and electric stoves. The ledger was likely in a dumpster, the iron bolt likely rusted shut. The landlady's authority had been defeated not by a single strike, but by the relentless, silent march of a million women who simply decided to walk out the door and never look back. As the sun began to set behind the emerging, jagged skyline of the Chrysler Building, Clara felt a surge of a strange, fierce pride. They were the bridge. They were the generation that had lived in the flickering gaslight and stepped boldly into the neon. They had carried the inky fingers of the industrial age into the golden era of the flapper and the radio. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, yellowed and fragile scrap of paper, the very first poem she had smuggled out of the office 10 years ago. The ink was faded, almost illegible now. She didn't need to read it. She knew every single word by heart. It was a poem about a girl who just wanted to see the horizon. With a steady hand, she tore the paper into tiny, microscopic pieces and let the New York wind take them. They fluttered like white confetti over the crowded sidewalk, lost in the roar of the traffic and the laughter of the evening crowds. "The horizon is finally here, Martha," Clara said, standing up and adjusting her hat in the reflection of the cafe window. "It's not a place we're going anymore. It's the life we're living right this second." She stepped out of the cafe and into the endless stream of the city. She walked fast, not because she was afraid of a curfew or a bolt, but because she was eager for the night to begin. The gaslight ambitions were fulfilled. The door was wide open, and as the electric lights of Broadway flickered to life, turning the New York sky into a canopy of artificial diamonds, Clara Penton realized that she was no longer a character in someone else's story about survival. She was the author of her own destiny. The roar of the 20s swallowed her up, a woman among millions, free, flawed, and finally, undeniably home.